I'm really excited to welcome you all here today for a conversation about the Seafood Alliance for Legality and Traceability, taking stock and next steps and thinking about how we can continue the great mission that SALT has had for the last 5 years and really try and move forward in integrating the work that they've done across the broad spectrum of transparency and traceability work that many of us here in the room and online are engaged in. Quick word of safety in the unlikely event of something occurring, please just head to the exits down the stairs and out the front door. Okay, so this is, I don't know how many forums we've had here now at CSIS around fisheries, but this is part of our ongoing series at the Stephenson Ocean Security Project, and we're working now closely in partnership with the Human Rights Initiative here at CSIS to really focus in on the combined challenges of illegal fishing and human rights abuses in the global seafood supply chain. There's an old saw about fisheries management that goes something like, it's sort of like forestry, but if you were doing it blindfolded and the trees moved. And of course, that's doubly challenging in today's world, where we're living in a world that is fully utilized. Not only do the trees move, but we need every single one of them. Globally, fish stocks are maximally exploited. FAO estimates that only something like 10% of global stocks are what we would consider to be underexploited, though that estimate is likely to be extremely conservative. Probably about at least 35% of existing stocks are already overexploited. And that's going to just increase in the coming years as our demand for seafood continues to increase. Moreover, we've been managing all these stocks as if we are living in a world that exists in status quo. That's not changing. We've developed about 150 years of fishery science around the idea that we can manage towards equilibrium. And that science has been quite advanced. It's really great. We've done a good job of learning a great deal about biology and ecology in the oceans. But all of that science is based around the idea that the world is static. And of course, we know the world's not static. The world's changing. We live in a changing world. The table is literally tilting out from under us as climate change affects global ecosystems. There are estimates that under the worst climate scenarios, something like 50% of the fishery productivity in the global south will be reduced over the next century. That's dramatic. And it's not something that our current management scenarios can really grapple with. On top of that, we have the problem of illegal fishing. I mentioned that current estimates are that we are maximally exploiting something like 90% of the stocks around the world. This, of course, doesn't account for illegal fishing, of fishing that is occurring above and outside of our view. And that's where issues of transparency and traceability come into play. The good news is that if we are able to fully implement more effective management measures, that we can grapple in large part with these challenges moving forward. But that requires us to take a really forthright and committed attitude towards engaging with those needed reforms. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. And really what we're here to celebrate is a program that has gone on, as I say, for the last 5 years, the Seafood Alliance for Legality and Traceability, and talk about the kind of work that they've been doing in countries around the globe, and regions around the globe where these kinds of reforms are most needed, and think about how we can come together to continue that great work. So to talk a little more about that and to introduce us a little further into today's conversation, I'd like to introduce Jenny Barker, the Executive Director of FishWise, which is the program that has been implementing SALT on behalf of a broad partnership. Thanks very much, Jenny.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so thankful to see many familiar faces here in person. I'm also certain that there are a lot of people online who are familiar in this space, but I'm also incredibly encouraged to see new faces in the room, which means interest continues to grow on this topic. So thanks to WIT, Marty, and CSIS overall for hosting us today. I also want to acknowledge and thank our partners in this endeavor for the last now 6 years, USAID, the Walton Family Foundation, Packard Foundation, and more foundations. They've been really instrumental in helping us really implement a program that focused on and saw the need for more information and more action around traceability and transparency in seafood supply chains, and really called on us to build a community and a network of people who wanted to learn more about traceability, who wanted to implement traceability as a tool to combat IUU fishing. I wanted to share a little bit about FishWise, as you may not be as familiar with us as an organization, but we do have 20 years experience working in this space to really promote seafood sustainability using markets as our major lever of change. And we really envision a future where the seafood industry works with government, works with civil society, and really takes full accountability for the people and the ocean resources upon which we depend. So we work directly with supply chains. We also work collaboratively to engage the more holistic sort of oceans issues through pre-competitive collaborations, different coalitions, understanding no one group can solve this problem alone. And then we also look and work in the governance space. And really we focus on combating IUU fishing and social responsibility in the context of markets. Really the core effort that I also want to bring to you today is around our efforts in social responsibility, directly advising industry, government, and NGOs on best practices. We take a more comprehensive approach, understanding that sustainability cannot just mean legality or environmental considerations, but you cannot have a sustainable supply chain if you have forced labor in that supply chain. So social responsibility issues being incredibly important. Currently, we are working to include more direct worker input in their agency into human rights due diligence. And one of the ways we do that is through an online platform called Rise. And so we kind of took that experience. Rise aggregates the best information around what one should do in the social responsibility space. We kind of in parallel were utilizing that same skill set to develop SALT. And really the idea being to promote learning and collaboration around electronic traceability, both identifying the needs of communities around the world and different actors to implement traceability, but also the essential question, if we've convinced you to implement traceability, how do you do it? And so you'll hear a lot today about a product we developed called the Comprehensive Traceability Principles, which takes a step approach to explaining how, in particular, governments around the world, producer country governments, can really go about implementing traceability. Just a quick bit about SALT, a few stats, and you'll hear more about it. But globally, we've reached about 89 countries we've had consultations with. It really shows the power of that sort of collective and collaborative impact to create alignment around certain goals and issues, and then to be able to scale those solutions. We really see that our role is to continue some of this work, even though SALT as a project is coming to an end. We really hope to continue to utilize traceability as an important tool in the box in order to address the issues we see on the high seas and you know, in small scale fisheries as well. And we really look forward to the conversation today, being able to tell us what that next frontier is and how do we galvanize, support, and identify the next kind of group who may hold this space. I think SALT, in a lot of ways, we've heard from our advisory committees and different players that SALT has been the place where you go to get your information on seafood traceability and transparency. What happens as that project comes to an end? And I think I really look forward to your ideas and figuring out a way we can continue this important work moving forward. So thank you again for coming, and we look forward to your thoughts today.
Great. Thank you so much for that welcome, Jenny, and orientation to the conversation that we're going to have today. Just a quick word. We're going to have, wrap the program today, we're going to have two panels talking about sort of where we've been and then where we might be going. But first, we'd like to start off with some brief remarks from Congressman Jared Huffman. Congressman Huffman has been a real leader on these issues for many years. I know that many of you know his work. He is currently the ranking member on the House Natural Resources, Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries Subcommittee, and previously has been the ranking member, the majority leader on that subcommittee. And he has had a real passion for combating the twin challenges of illegal fishing and human rights abuses in the seafood sector. In the last Congress, he and Congressman Graves introduced the Combating Illegal Fishing and Human Rights Abuses Act. And we know that they are continuing work in this space in this Congress as well. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and have you turn your attention to the screens here, and we'll see some prepared remarks from Congressman Huffman. Thank you.
Hi folks, I'm Congressman Jared Huffman from the North Coast of California. Thanks for inviting me to share a few words on illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, or IUU fishing as we call it. I've dedicated much of my career in public office, and before that as an environmental attorney, to protecting fisheries and natural resources. I'm also ranking member of the subcommittee on water, wildlife, and fisheries, and before I came to Congress, I chaired the Assembly Water Parks and Wildlife Committee in California. And on top of all that, in my personal life, I love to fish. So the sustainability of our oceans and marine fisheries is near and dear to me. We need to raise awareness about IUU fishing because it's a terrible threat to the health, sustainability, and resilience of our ocean ecosystems and marine fisheries. But if you mention IUU fishing to most people, they have no idea what you're talking about. If the damage to our oceans and fisheries was not enough, IUU fishing also undercuts our well-regulated, sustainable American fisheries and all of the fishing families and communities who play by the rules. It's hard for them to be competitive in the global marketplace when unscrupulous, shadowy bad actors are flooding the seafood supply chain with illegally caught seafood. And there's another human angle here. IUU fishing often involves egregious human rights violations, including slave labor and human trafficking. Victims are forced to live and work in utterly unsafe, cruel, inhumane conditions. They can be trapped at sea for years on end. Crew members can be subjected to myriad injustices, including physical, psychological, and sexual abuse, unsanitary and unsafe working conditions, 20-hour workdays, lack of pay, even murder. How do they get away with all these abuses? Well, IUU fishing happens on the high seas, well beyond the horizon, far out of sight, where bad actors can engage in illegal, unethical, and brutal practices with impunity. Poor oversight, weak regulation, lack of transparency, all of this makes the commercial fishing sector an easy target for horrific abuses. And most consumers aren't even aware that these crimes are happening off our shores. And all the while, these illegally sourced products are flowing right into our seafood supply chain, onto our grocery store shelves, and ultimately our dinner plates. The U.S. is the world's largest seafood importer, but because of gaps in current policies, we are using a lot of our purchasing power to unwittingly import seafood that was caught using illicit and inhumane practices. In other words, we're propping up environmental crimes, forced labor, and slavery on the high seas. Our country and our consumers deserve better. Our domestic fishing communities deserve better. It's past time to close the gaps and get our policies in line with our values. That's why I've championed the Illegal Fishing and Forced Labor Prevention Act with my colleague, Congressman Garrett Graves from Louisiana. Last December, we were able to celebrate some of this bill becoming law as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, but there is still more work to be done. Our updated framework cracks down on IUU fishing by expanding NOAA's Seafood Import Monitoring Program, establishing seafood traceability and labeling requirements, improving seafood inspections, and strengthening international fisheries management. It's simple. Seafood should not come at the cost of human rights. And although the solutions aren't quite simple, there's a lot that we can and must do to put an end to IUU fishing. Thank you for hosting this important forum and for raising awareness on this international humanitarian crisis. I look forward to continuing this critical work together. Thank you.
We thank Congressman Huffman for those remarks and for his continued work in this space. It's really critical to have leaders like him in Congress, and we deeply appreciate his commitment to the issue. I'd like now to turn to a a different perspective on this, and this is the voice of somebody who's been a practitioner, somebody who has been engaged in the work in partnership with SALT for a number of years. I'm going to introduce remarks by Fareed Maroof. Fareed's been a leading seafood traceability initiatives in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. He's led many projects in the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam, working closely with fisheries managers, value chain actors, technology and service providers, as well as NGOs, funders, and multilateral organizations. He's the kind of guy who's on the ground and working with communities to help implement some of these ideas. So I'd like to transition now to Fareed's remarks. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today as we come together to celebrate the closing of SALT project. I want to begin by extending my heartfelt congratulations to the entire SALT team and all those who have been part of this remarkable journey. Now, as we reflect upon the achievement and challenge of seafood traceability, let us acknowledge the incredible progress we have made. In many regions around the world, significant strides has been taken to ensure that the seafood we consume is both safe and sustainable. While SALT has been driving force behind this achievement through its hard work, passion, and vision, it is important to note that it's not alone in this endeavor. SALT, along with other dedicated organizations, has been instrumental in advancing traceability and legality in the seafood industry. Yes, as we celebrate this accomplishment, we must also acknowledge that certain crucial challenges still exist significantly. Specifically, three paramount issues continue to demand our attention: interoperability, inclusiveness, and data utilization. Interoperability. In a global supply chain that involves numerous entities, from fishermen and processors to distributors and retailers, ensuring that all systems can communicate and share data seamlessly is a formidable task. Achieving interoperability requires standardized data format and protocol that can be adopted by all stakeholders. The second major challenge is inclusiveness. Seafood traceability participation and benefit should not be limited to a select few players in the industry. It must encompass the entire supply chain, from small-scale artisanal fishermen to large seafood corporations. Achieving inclusiveness means providing affordable and accessible traceability solutions that can be adopted by all regardless of their size or resources. This inclusivity is essential to ensure that no one is ignored in the journey towards sustainable seafood. This also entails ensuring that the benefit trickle down to all stakeholders. In my region, the adoption of seafood traceability measures varies considerably among different countries, with both private sectors and government involvement displaying distinct level of commitment and progress. The SALT initiative emerged as a potential catalyst for leveling the playing field and mitigating potential hurdles that some nations might encounter during their traceability journey. The third challenge we must address pertaining to the effective utilization of data. While amassing vast quantity of data is one aspect, extracting meaningful insight from it is an entirely different game. It encompasses not only the issues of data intrinsic value and the benefit it can yield, but also intricately intertwines with concerns related to data security and privacy. To optimize adoption and scalability, the path to realizing the inherent value of data should offer a streamlined and clear path accessible to both data owners and its sources. This will enable to make informed decisions about the sustainability and safety of seafood products, ultimately benefit both consumers and environment. Quo-vadis, where are we heading? I firmly believe that we must integrating AI and machine learning more into our approach. The significance of AI and machine learning cannot be emphasized enough. This advanced technology not only boosts data use with advanced analytics, but also remove hurdles in collecting and validating data through automation. They hold transformative power to revolutionize our approach to seafood traceability, ushering in an era marked by improved accuracy, efficiency, and effectiveness. In conclusion, let us continue to carry the torch of seafood traceability forward. The achievement and challenge we discussed today are part of the broader journey toward a more transparent, ethical, and sustainable seafood industry. Congratulations once again to SALT for your invaluable contribution. Together we ensure that the legacy of SALT lives on, benefiting our oceans, our community, and our future generation.
Once again, thank you to Fareed for those remarks. So now I'd like to welcome our first panel up to the stage, and we will have a conversation about the challenges and achievements of seafood traceability. A sort of a look back on the last 5 years and just a peek ahead to where we might be going, which we'll talk about in our second panel of the day. Jenny Barker is going to moderate this panel. Thank you.
Can you? Yes, you can hear me with this. Great. Excellent. Well, I want to welcome my panelists here today. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that having 5 women on stage talking about seafood issues feels exciting to me because, yes, thank you. Because I think at times, as we've seen through reports and studies, that maybe women's role and acknowledgement in seafood is underestimated. I am here today to both acknowledge some of the achievements we've had through the specific work that we've done on SALT, but we would not be a legitimate learning project if we didn't acknowledge some of the challenges we've had. And in order to get better, to be more effective at the work we do, you're going to hear a little bit today about some of the struggles we've had through implementation of this project, but also some of the successes we've had that we hope as a community and as a network we can continue to push forward in this space. I will have the panelists introduce themselves shortly, but I do just want to acknowledge that I have a lot of appreciation for everyone on this stage and the role that they have played in SALT. Jovis, who represents the government of Tanzania, we met in 2019 at the World Seafood Congress, and she said to me, we're really interested in implementing traceability. We want to do traceability in Tanzania. How can we work together? Which was the start of a relationship that now has resulted in a strategy there. Sarah has been a colleague at FishWise and an excellent source of expertise and a real leader in this principles conversation for us. Jenny Kane has been a partner at USAID as the kind of lead and key point person for us and a thought partner in this work. And Mariana has led work in Mexico and utilization of the principles, which is really so essential for us to really test the theoretical principles that we develop. So each of these people have really played an important role in SALT, and I just want to be appreciative of them. I do want to share a little bit more about SALT and some of the things that we've done and some things that you may hear a bit about on the panel, but I think makes SALT somewhat unique. As many of you who may know who are involved with it, the way we started the Seafood Alliance for Legality and Traceability as this sort of learning and collaboration opportunity around seafood traceability was utilizing a year-long co-design process. So for us, co-design means you build the programs with the stakeholders you intend to serve. And so we held 3 events around the globe, multi-day events, talking to people about what their knowledge and learning needs were around traceability, what their barriers to doing traceability were, what potential benefits they saw for traceability, if they needed to understand what those looked like more. And those 3 co-design events culminated in something we called kind of a partner lab, but to analyze all the data that came from those, identify what priorities came out, and then plan again with the stakeholders we intended to serve. And through that process, we essentially identified 2 major themes for what we wanted to do with SALT. One was to talk more about the potential benefits and the things that would help sort of incentivize traceability at different levels of the supply chain. And the other thing was just the very simple question of, if you're interested in utilizing traceability as a tool to combat IUU fishing or to promote legality or better safety in your supply chain, how do you do it? There really wasn't a place where you could go to learn about ways to implement seafood traceability. And I think SALT really held that space for the last 6 years. There was a lot of gathering of information, best practices, and then really the application of those theoretical concepts on the ground to test and then revise what approaches that we suggested that one should take to successfully implement traceability. I will note that one of the things that was unique about SALT and where we decided to focus given the gap we had identified, there was growing interest and knowledge from industry through different things like the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability that was trying to align around data elements that industry should collect in order to promote seafood traceability. There was growing interest in that space, and we really looked to see who are the stakeholders not being served, who are the players in the system who have not sort of been the focus of some of this work. And really we identified what we called producer countries, which were the countries where the product was sourced, were a stakeholder group that hadn't been engaged as much, that were looking for resources, were looking for information. And so we decided to make that a priority focus of SALT, still utilizing what we knew about businesses and companies to incorporate the best practices, but to really focus on what it looks like in the context of a government official like Jovis to support them to promote traceability within their countries in order to achieve that broader impact. So with that, I am just going to turn it to my colleagues and panelists, and just ask you to introduce yourself briefly, your organization, and what your sort of linkage is, or what your connection to SALT was.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you to SALT, to FishWise, and to CSIS for inviting us to participate in this panel. As you said, I'm very glad to be sharing this with an all-women panel. My name is Mariana Assis. I work for Oceana in Mexico. And what we've been doing in Oceana in Mexico is trying to advance traceability through the approval of an official seafood traceability standard. It's something that we've been doing for the past couple of years. We're convinced that traceability is the way to move forward in the seafood industry. It's a tool to combat IUU fishing. It also allows us to have better management of the seafood resources, therefore sustainability. And we have seen how this also creates healthy and prosperous fishing communities. So in Oceana in Mexico, we are very convinced of the work we're doing towards traceability. And we have been working in collaboration with SALT, because we have been, going back and forth on these principles you mentioned and how they can be incorporated into the Mexican standard. We have been advancing in this. We already have a traceability standard, which incorporates a lot of the principles that SALT has worked in. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in the next section. But the work that SALT been doing has been fundamental for the Mexican official traceability standard.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Jenny Kane. I am a Senior Biodiversity and Natural Resources Advisor at the U.S. Agency for International Development. And I have to pause to say I am so thrilled to be here and be at this point with SALT. I'm the agency's lead point of contact for SALT for the past 6 years, but noting that a lot apparently gets done at these global events, I think the seed of the idea for this came between Walton Family Foundation and AID back at the Ocean Conference in 2016. So this is a long time in the making with nearly 2,000 people and growing engaged at this point. So it's just wonderful. And SALT has been one of our most important partnerships in countering IUU fishing at USAID, again, in partnership with Walton Family Foundation, Packard, and more. And I'm excited to talk to you more about that history and all of the collaboration that's gone into it.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Lewis. I'm the director of our traceability division at FishWise. I've been at FishWise for 9 years, and I still haven't even begun to meet everyone in our space, which is really kind of exciting because it shows that it keeps growing all the time. So my work with this program has largely been as an advisor on the technical and traceability side, and a lot of it started off, as I'll speak to a little bit later, with our consultative committee. So that's where I actually first met some of you in the room as part of the post-co-design, pre-principles design meeting of the minds that lasted over a year to really pull the practices from the community in terms of what principles for traceability should really be. And then to get into the operationalizing of them, I was lucky enough to come and help the team on the technical work in Tanzania, and that was a real honor. So yeah, I'll get into a little bit more later, but it's a pleasure to be here.
Morning, everybody. My name is Jovis Mkuchu. I'm from Tanzania in eastern part of Africa. I'm working with the Ministry of Livestock and Fisheries. I'm a principal fish technologist, but I'm working as fish inspector. Specifically with our SALT team, I come to join, as Jane said, back to 19, where I've been one of the members to participate on developing comprehensive electronic catch documentation traceability. And after completing that, SALT look for the country which can be able to pilot these principles, and I, together with USAID, we see that is a better opportunity for the country to improve our traceability system. So where we come up with a program of developing this, piloting these principles in our country, and we end up having a strategy on octopus fishery for electronic traceability. Thank you.
Great, thank you. One thing I just want to reiterate that I was remiss in mentioning, because many of you were part of this group. So as part of the broader SALT Alliance, again, trying to bring the diversity of expertise to the table, we did have a really permanent sort of advisory committee to SALT throughout the entirety of the project. And the advisory committee was really essential both for the information sharing, but we gathered such a wealth of expertise. So we had governments represented from the government of Japan. Obviously, the US government had representatives from NOAA, the Department of Labor, the Department of State were part of our advisory committee. We had important NGOs like WWF. We had FutureFish, who does more localized work. We had a CSIS as an advisor in that group, and many others. We had some companies, Iberostar, which is a hospitality company. And so we really kind of, beyond the sort of initial co-design, we're continually getting advice and inputs from the experts in the field. We understood that, we did not have all the information you needed to successfully do this. We needed to call on others who could bring their expertise to the table. So I do just want to acknowledge that advisory committee and the importance and the important role that they played overall. So first, I'm going to go to Sarah and ask you, since you have been so essential and at really the core of the technical work with SALT, helping us really get the principles right, if you will. Tell us a little bit about that principles development process, if you will, and what were some of those kind of key moments where you felt like there were wins we were having, but then there are also sometimes some challenges that we were encountering going through this process.
Yeah, I was thinking about this as we're coming out with Principles 2.0, and you all have copies of it, but it's been a real journey. We started with this idea that we didn't have all the answers and we needed to convene the experts. And so it all began with the consultative committee recruitment, just basically trying to talk about SALT, the decisions and the direction that we got from co-design, and really invite as many people to the table as we could to take part in a series of discussions and provide feedback on what our needs were in terms of the guidance related to traceability. And one of the initial challenges that we came across in this really diverse group of people that have all different angles on the issues is this tension between the need for principles, best practices versus best processes. So do we need best practice to be defined? Do we need to have clarity? And we did. We need to have clarity on what we're striving for, what that sort of light that we're trying to move towards looks like versus how do we get there? So that's where the principles actually moved from just being a set of guidance on the what to also including the pathway, which is really focusing on how do we get there, the process side. And that was a challenge that I think turned out to be a win overall, because really one of the things that we were hearing is that there were a lot of existing best practices to build upon. And so the need was really the implementation assistance that the pathway really could help meet. Another kind of challenge was just the capacity of the group to, after the principles were developed, we started in our 6th year, which we were fortunate enough to have an additional year to test. So it became a challenge to try to find the places where there was readiness, and that was where we were fortunate enough to have opportunities in various parts of the world. But the capacity to actually begin this rather intensive process, we needed to have some assistance in identifying where those kind of prime opportunities were. And so we again went out and really tried to share that SALT was there to support and provide assistance and technical capacity where maybe that was one of the barriers that people were facing. And I think that made a difference. So actively going out and saying, we're here to help, made a big difference, because there's a lot of willingness, but there isn't always all of the levers in place to understand how to turn something that's a document into an actual strategy, right? So a little bit of that capacity building piece was essential too.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think originally we did conceive of it as more of this amalgamation, this sort of learning product that would give people, we kind of call the principles the guiding lights, or these sort of 6, good ways to practice by being inclusive with people, right? By understanding what the data needs are across a system, all of those elements of those 6 principles, which, as Sarah said, you can see in your handouts there. But at the end, that group was really reflective and said, yes, but then how? Like, these are lovely, lofty goal, things to do, but tell me how I put this into practice. And so that consultative group worked really hard to come up with a step-by-step process that you'll see online and in those documents. So that's great. Jenny, let me ask you, as someone who was there from the beginning, you saw the origin and the evolution, as you kind of said in your opening remarks, your happiness to be here. Tell me more about those collaborative efforts that happened, the partnerships that have really kind of helped us grow, I guess, over the years, or expanded our impact, and how you see they have contributed to success, and then maybe also looking at some of those strategies that have been most effective. What would you say those might be, and how can we continue to do those, kind of that collaboration to scale globally?
Sure. So I think there are a few different strategies that are at work. SALT, of course, is a global development alliance, which is one of the ways that USAID partners with the private sector. So in this case, our partners, again, are the Walton Family Packard and Moore Foundations. And so that is what enabled us initially to come together, of course. But then I went back. There's so many layers of collaboration in SALT. That was something that SALT has also very much taken to heart from the get-go. USAID's approach to collaborating, learning, and adapting, CLA, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. You can go to learninglab.org to learn more about it. But it's the way that we want to do work and do co-design as much as possible. So looking back at those layers, there was this initial coming together of USAID and the philanthropic foundations around the idea of SALT. And then there was a co-design within that group to see what this might look like. And again, we expanded to some of the folks who eventually were on the advisory committee, brought in FishWise. And then, as you noted, there was a whole year of co-design that got kicked off. And this has been, for us, a really effective way to work with the private sector, so to collaborate on the design of SALT initially, but then to build a community where the private sector, governments, and NGOs can all come in. And so after that year of co-design, and we were supported by a group called Collaborate Up, as you've discussed, there was collaboration on the principles, there's been collaboration on the Tanzania strategy. So I think really embedding the users in SALT from the get-go, that the work always happens with them and that they're helping to drive it and aid, obviously, localization is a really big push, equity inclusion, a lot of discussion of nothing about us without us. So really bringing everyone in early on has been very important for us.
I remember a few conversations we had with people over the years where we were describing all of that collaboration, and people were impressed and surprised that we co-design to co-design to collaborate to co-design. But I think I feel like it has really helped to build this network and this community. So thanks for that. Jovis, next for you. So as our representative of what I was saying as a producer country government, what we would say, right? Tanzania is, and you, as you said, are at the Ministry of Livestock and Fisheries. Tanzania has been our one sort of engagement on the ground to really test the principles fully at that initial phase. And you've been essential to that, one of our major partners. Can you just give me some specific examples about how the principles have been applied in that context? Tell us maybe a little bit about your experience with that process of us developing this strategy and how you think that they will impact fisheries management. And then after that, I would love just to hear, you do represent this unique voice on the panel. You were an advocate for traceability. You were the person who was really pushing it. And so how do you, as a government representative, how were you able to successfully do that to get to the point where the Minister of Livestock and Fisheries spoke at the opening of our event? And there were lots of representations at different levels, at the district level, people who came, who were leaders there. So your role was really important in that, how you were able to do that as well.
To start with your second question, the government of Tanzania is really make traceability as a priority. In the year back, we have a fish ban in Lake Victoria. We are not supposed to export due to food safety risk. So after uplifting the ban, the government through the ministry decided to put traceability as one of the priority. So we have regulations about traceability in our Act and regulations. And we have some, we do have traceability in paperwork, but we still have some of challenges like law enforcement. Paper might get lost, of course, data not have a good quality. So, and the IUU, it's difficult to combat the full issue of IUU. So we thought that this piloting comprehensive traceability principle will be a solution. So after coming with this idea, we think that the government thought that it might help us and give us a solution. So the government, together with SALT and USAID, after coming up with the program, we get a goal and a scope that we should pilot it for octopus fishery in Kilwa district. And for that case, we applied, the principal have got the pathway. So we started with initiation phase and designing, though the designing phase is not yet completed. at the pathway principles, pathway initiation stage, we do 3 principles only. But at the designing, we applied all the 6 principles. And the issue of inclusiveness and collaboration with stakeholders from the ground was a key element to tackle, to be considered. Yeah. During the co-designing stage, all the stakeholders were being invited because at the initiation stage, what have been done was to map the stakeholders, all the stakeholders. Other traceability system, most of the stakeholders are being left behind. Yeah, we used to enforce it. We think traceability is for enforcement also only, but issue of collaboration is very important to make them feel that traceability is for their own benefit, not for the government benefit. So during co-designing, all the stakeholders, it was multi-stakeholders event. Yeah, and the underrepresented group and small-scale fishers and women were fully represented and have being able to say their views, what they need to see in the traceability, what is the gap, what is the challenges. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And and to build on that point, you know, women fishers, women industry leaders were in the room, and part of obviously the essential way that you allowed that inclusion was the event was held in Swahili. So of course the fishers could feel confident in participating. And I think we heard really positive feedback that many people in the room had never had a forum like that where a fisher was sitting across from an industry member with a government representative and an NGO here, and really just hearing each other's perspectives on what they need. So I was really pleased to see, I think, how well it was received, and really I felt people felt it was a transformative kind of event in that way to hear their perspective.
Yeah, sure. For the better traceability system, both the government, the stakeholders, and the other partners should collaborate to make the system work. So for good traceability system, there should be a good political will from the government. That's why you saw that our minister was there during the event. And the stakeholders, all the stakeholders which were mapped in the initial stage was there. So nobody was left behind, and everybody was able to speak their role. They were able to map the octopus pathway to see where is the gap, which data they might need on the future designed electronic traceability. Yeah,
wonderful, thank you. Mariana, so SALT ended up doing a good amount of work, or was happy to be in kind of the region that USA would classify as like Latin America and the Caribbean, because there's a lot of interest and it feels like demand. You spoke a little bit in your opening remarks to the fact that you have some programs in place, and the question is, you know, are we revisiting, are we amending or changing them based on our experience? So I would love to hear from your perspective with your work in Mexico, sort of how the principles might have influenced the work you're doing. Tell us a little bit more about that, related also right to the federal, to the sort of nationwide traceability regulation that you were working on.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned earlier, we are working currently on getting an official federal seafood traceability approved. And SALT principles really influenced the work we did over the creation of this draft rule, which is not approved yet, but we hope it is soon. I want to mention some of the principles we incorporated. First of all, I think it's very important to mention that the working group that created this traceability draft was a multi-sectorial and interdisciplinary group. There were some NGOs there, including Oceana, but many more. There were also members of the fishing sector involved in the creation of the draft, which is something we say you don't see very often, like the regulatees being involved in the regulation they are going to use. And that was something that was essential for creating this standard, and also the government participated at some point. So the principle that SALT has as one of its main guiding principles, which is inclusiveness, was there during the creation of this draft. So I think that was something very important to create a comprehensive draft that incorporated the artisanal sector and the industry perspective. We know we couldn't have a draft that was going to be useful when implemented if they were not there participating. Also, we really relied upon the data needs and data verification. We did a very careful evaluation of which data was needed. For example, which key data elements was needed along the critical events of the supply chain. So, for example, we started thinking what was already there and what were they already registering. For example, a big advancement now is in Mexico is that we have electronic catch documentation. The only problem is that it doesn't talk with the next paperwork along the supply chain. That's why we're pushing so hard towards traceability. But we were thinking what data is already there. So we kind of realized, for example, we already had people gathering their boat permit, the region they were fishing in, the species they were fishing. So we wanted to take advantage of that was already being done and incorporate it into the traceability standard, and also make sure that people didn't have to do twice the amount of work they were already doing, because we were aware, and also a lot of artisanal fishers told us, like, another step or another paperwork can be very burdensome for us and can have significant impact in our work. So we try to do this draft as easy as possible for them to fulfill their obligations. So that was also a very important principle that was incorporated into this. And finally, the interoperability was very important. And I want to mention that SALT principles make sense, because that was one of the main asks from the fishing sector. They were saying, like, we need this system to be interoperable with ones that already exist. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this in the next section. But in Mexico, since we don't have a traceability standard currently operating, a lot of members of the fishing sector, artisanal fisheries and industry members are already putting into place their own traceability systems, and they're getting ahead even of the government requirements. So they really wanted this official traceability to be interoperable with the ones that they were already putting into place, or maybe ones that they need to use for exporting and these kind of requirements. So this is a principle that is set in the traceability draft expressly. So it says the system needs to be interoperable with other ones. As this hasn't been implemented, we still need to figure out in how this system is going to work. But that was one of the main asks of the industry, and this is something we consider it was very important to incorporate. So data verification, inclusiveness, interoperability, having an electronic system are all of SALT's principles, which are already being taken into account in this traceability draft that Mexico is working on.
Great, thank you. And I think you're reiterating something I heard Fareed say in his comments before about this interoperability, this idea that one data system is sufficiently talking to another data system so that information and data flows freely throughout the system. You do a lot of work, like you said, you get to the electronic catch documentation, you have the first step in the supply chain, and then it's meant to go to a paper-based system or what have you. And so sometimes just the act of getting that system right and sharing the information more freely can be really important. You noted that industry was sort of ahead, and I think we have seen that in traceability sometimes, why we chose to kind of focus on governments a little bit. But I'm curious in the context of your experience in Mexico, are there things, are there more international things or regional things that help or hinder maybe Mexico in this space of doing a regulatory framework? And like, would more governments maybe regionally, helping to support, or is it more of just a nationally led effort in your mind?
I think it's both national and international. We all know that the seafood supply chain is one of the more complex and globalized ones. So for Mexico as a producer country, it is impossible to conceive itself without the international market. So it's been an effort led nationally by the fishing sector. They have come to realize that it's very important, not just for fulfilling international obligations, but talking to, for example, fishing cooperatives that are small artisanal groups of fishers. They come to realize also that this gives them a lot of efficiency in their day-to-day work, because they know what they are fishing, they know what they have in stock, they know what they have sold. So this is a big incentive for them, but also in the international aspect of things, fulfilling with international legal obligations and being able to export their product is a big incentive.
Yeah. Great, thank you. So one of the sort of final questions I want to ask each of my panelists is just what are you excited, or what would you like to see really move forward? What do you think the future is, and how do we ensure, I think we've heard a lot of different sort of statements about the importance of buy-in from different stakeholders. We 100% believe, as we said, in building things with the people that you intend to serve, but we've heard in different ways the importance of industry being a leader, the importance of political will at a governmental level. So also hearing from you, what's most exciting to move forward, and how do we get that buy-in in the future from those essential stakeholders? Jenny, let me just start with you and your perspective from a USAID perspective.
I think one of the things I'm most excited about is the way that SALT has really socialized and built support for this comprehensive approach, which we noted is about inclusion and equity, but also about making sure that these traceability systems are addressing economic, ecological, and social goals, so bringing all of those together. And that's especially important, of course, for USAID being a development organization, because fisheries, IU fishing, touch on so many different sectors and sector goals. So whether that is countering IU fishing, improving marine conservation fisheries management, food security, human health, nutrition, everything is in there. So I think that comprehensive approach that notes that these systems can help support and provide data for sure meeting import requirements, also for feeding back for fisheries management, and then the social component that we'll hear more about later on the next panel. I'm really excited to hear that language out there more. I see that even when SALT isn't specifically being discussed, you start to see traceability for economic, ecological, social goals. I hope you all go home with that too. So I'm very excited about that. And I think also the fact of the principles existing and having been so collaboratively developed and then already applied in Tanzania for a strategy, they exist. Like we all saw as soon as the principles were out there in multiple languages, in addition to the direct support that SALT was providing. So say in Peru or Tanzania, Indonesia, Vietnam, a lot of different places, the principles were being picked up by others. And so a community had come together to articulate these, created this product, which could be both directly supported or also being as user-friendly as it is, used by others as they found it. And then I know you were getting emails about different governments saying, we're using this for our current work. And it was things that we wouldn't have been aware of if folks hadn't reached out. So I'm tremendously excited about all of that. And of course at USAID, there's a great awareness among our different missions that the principles exist, and IU fishing and fisheries management continue to be a big part of our work, both in biodiversity conservation and food security. So I'm really excited by all the momentum that's been created.
Yeah. And you bring up a good point that, we had them translated into 5 languages, I believe. So the principles were usable in different places. And we did sometimes, once we put them out there and had promoted them, we would, sort of accidentally find out that someone was utilizing them to build the traceability regulation with the government of Peru a consultant who was working with them had come across them and said, these are wonderful. I've already done the first 2 stages. Could you help me with the next? And so, yeah, really exciting that both, I think it was rightfully designed, that there was a demand and a need for this information. And once we filled that demand, then it was able to more quickly go forward. Mariana, how about you? Your sort of what you're excited to do to continuing your work, and how do we maybe leverage, you spoke a little bit to the importance of leveraging fishers in this conversation and getting their buy-in to make sure it's successful moving forward.
Yes, well, at this stage, I consider like leveraging the seafood industry support towards the standard is essential, at least in Mexico. I was a little bit jealous of Jovis when she mentioned that the government of Tanzania has a lot of political will to advance traceability, and it's something we're not currently seeing in Mexico. We see that the industry is moving forward, the artisanal fishing sector, the international markets, but we haven't seen the government actually take this step forward and actually, well, push forward traceability. And I think there's no sustainability without the government. So right now, I'm really hopeful that they will be participating much more closely in this approval process, which is fundamental for them to be in. I think the fishing sector needs traceability in Mexico, and as I said, they are already implementing it by themselves, so it's notorious. We just need the government to be part of this alliance. So I think moving forward, I would like to see much more government involvement. And as Jenny said, I'm really happy that these kind of terms are becoming part of our more day-to-day lingo. I think we cannot move forward without knowing where our seafood comes from. It's crazy that you have a fish in your plate and you don't know where it comes from. Many people here probably consume Mexican seafood. If you eat grouper or red snapper, there's a big chance it comes from Mexico. So it's important for people to know this, and that it's legally sourced, it's sustainably sourced, even if it's come from industrial vessels, artisanal vessels. So I think we are getting there in people being involved in traceability and wanting to know where their seafood comes from. So from a Mexico perspective, we have the consumers, we have the industry, we have the artisanal fisheries, NGOs, which is something that not all of these groups sometimes are all in agreement with. So we just need the government to step through, and for international markets and buyer countries to keep pushing these standards, for example, such as SIMP, is essential for producers countries such as Mexico to advance in these standards.
Yeah, great, thank you. Jovis, what about you? What are you most excited about? And you may also just share with us sort of how you feel about that sustained buy-in from the government of Tanzania. And, to Mariana's point, sort of not having it is a huge barrier, but I think maintaining it might also, could be a challenge. So what are you excited about, and what is it about the future sustaining through the government?
What excited me more about this is that we in Tanzania, we use traceability for food safety, maybe, and IUU enforcement. But on applying this principle, there will be more benefit on ecological and social issues. So I think the government is a piloting area for these principles. We want to be one of the leading example country to make sure that we have the technology in place. So in future, we wanted to apply, to implement the strategy, which you have already in place. So with SART and other partners, we will continue to look for technological solution which will be applicable in the small scale levels, because it might be challenging, but I'm sure if we have a good technology and cheaper one, it will be manageable to everybody. So for that case, I want to say that we thank USAID for supporting us and FishWise through SALT project and other partners to ensure that Tanzania will change its traceability from paperwork to electronic one. Yeah, to start with, we are going to pilot it in octopus fishery in one district, Kilwa district. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Good, thank you for that. And it's probably worth, noting at this point that, part of where, the cycle of the project of SALT comes to an end, and we were able to, again, apply the principles in Tanzania, but essentially resulting in a strategy that operates a little bit like a work plan. And now, in the short term, our work there has stopped. But as FishWise, we want to carry some of these important tools forward. And so one of the things we're doing now, we know USAID in Tanzania has some interest in it, but one of the things we're trying to commit to do is to continue to support the use of the principles as best practice, even though obviously the project itself is coming to an end. FishWise feels really strongly that there are good opportunities to continue this work. So we obviously are going to keep in touch with you and our partners and look forward to getting to implementation of that strategy. Sarah, let me close at least this portion of it, and we'll turn it over to questions next. But hear from you on what you're excited about moving forward, and how do we get that buy-in from the right stakeholders?
Yeah, well, anyone who knows me knows I have an abundance of excitement for this work, probably more than I should, as somebody that really likes traceability, because I feel the impact is really what gets me up in the morning, and we're seeing it growing every day, which, that's what I'm looking forward to. But one of the elements that I think is really exciting, and I know I share this common interest with many of you all, is in starting to better unpack and define transparency as it relates to traceability and the various roles that we all have in supporting that, whether we're in the industry or government, because there's a lot of need for additional use cases for traceability, and with greater transparency, we can innovate. We can verify, we can, document impact better, right? If people talk about what they do, talk about, learning from the leaders and the examples that we have. So it's not just data transparency, although that's critical. It is also transparency about how we're working, and that's what SALT has always been about, is making everybody else aware of the great examples and the learnings that are in the field. So I'm really excited for that work to continue with a real emphasis on better defining and creating use cases around different elements of this comprehensive definition of traceability. And then I think the other piece is there's a lot of areas where we can see traceability application having a particularly important impact, or maybe we'd call it low-hanging fruit, but it's not, because nothing's easy. But, for me, there's ports, there's processing phases, there's transshipment vessels. These are places where if we have traceability in place, we're getting enormous value, because these are important transport or transformation steps within supply chains. And so we don't necessarily need every piece of data about everything all the time, but we can start identifying these areas, these elements of supply chains that we really get the value out of, and then design our programs and our interoperability steps and all of that around those pieces. And then the last piece, I actually wanted to build on what you were saying, Jenny, about nothing about us without us. I really feel that there's a growth edge for our work related to the inclusiveness of worker points of view, worker perspectives, and really helping to build out the social side of the comprehensive benefits that we're looking to achieve, right? So the idea of the principles has always been that everyone can apply them to their own situation, integrate with what is already there, and also have a layer of their own values. What do they want to see? What are the benefits they care about? But who defines those benefits has not been as inclusive as we've all been talking about. So really thinking about, we've already touched on gender, like power dynamics, but also just, including the folks that are actually doing the harvest, the processing, and really asking them, especially when it comes to trying to enumerate the social benefits. I don't want to tell them what their social benefits should be.
Exactly.
So that work is really exciting, and I think that's something that our whole community is getting behind, and I'm happy to see it.
That's great. And you remind me of a couple of things, Sarah. One is that, when we were looking at traceability as as a tool to help contribute to improving social conditions and supply chains, no one certainly thinks it's the only or a sufficient tool. No. So we identified some data points that were already being collected that could identify high risk for forced labor, let's say, in supply chains, things like transshipment, time at sea, things like that. But the social benefits aren't just necessarily in those most egregious examples that we've heard at sea. When we were in Tanzania talking to fishers about the social benefits, there was a really excellent conversation about the importance of the unfortunate nature of drowning deaths that were happening at sea in Tanzania that people, the government wasn't necessarily tracking yet on that side of things. And so when they heard what is a social benefit, what do you as a fisher need to feel like you are protected in some way, we were hearing different sort of items, so there's a spectrum of what we say when we mean social, and what is that? How do we hear from people about what they need and what their specific job might entail, and how can we help improve their lives through some of these systems as well? And if data is one way, but certainly have to have them at the conversation. Excellent. Well, I think we have about 30 minutes even at this point for questions. We certainly wanted to, or shorter, I'm seeing this sign. Okay, shorter for questions at this point. Would love to, great. Please come to the microphones. We'll answer your questions. And then just to let you know, we do have a large number of people online, so we just want to make sure that we are answering those questions as well. Please, and introduce yourself or your organization, I assume.
Hi, I'm Peter Humphrey, an international affairs analyst, and coincidentally a former science officer at our embassy in Mexico. My question concerns a development this month. The Fukushima Daiichi radioactive nuclear waters are being released into the Pacific Ocean slowly but surely starting this month. And Japan is claiming that this is going at such low rates that it effectively matches the Pacific Ocean's own contamination of those elements. In response, because there's no traceability on the fish in Japan, and will be no traceability in the future, the Chinese preemptively have said, starting with the release of this water, we're not going to buy your fish anymore. This is a huge hit for the Japanese fish market. And I'm wondering if there's any role in this technology, to use this technology, to trace the fish stocks, particularly the trace elements in the fish stocks, to check up and see if the Chinese are crazy or whether some of these Fukushima radioactive elements may wind up in the Pacific fish stocks.
Without being an expert, excellent. I will defer to Sarah, and I will add anything else.
And I don't know anything specifically about radioactive isotopes, but I do know there's a lot of work that's already gone in the trace world around isotopes. I wouldn't imagine that it would need to be a governmental scale program to track that. I imagine there could be someone like an Oceana that's done lots of work looking at different identification of risk factors within fish in the marketplace. So I think, yes, there could certainly be some investigative needs, but I don't personally think that's something that we've seen a government monitor at a broad level. It's possible, though. You can tell how old fish are. You can tell what waters they've been swimming in if you have samples from the place of origin and you compare it to the actual fish. So if we can do that, I'm sure we can do it with radioactive isotopes as well. So best guess.
Great.
Hi, I'm Jane Hageman. Sorry, I'm not that tall. I'm a consultant in the global health space, and I'm just curious, you had mentioned that the people who are already legally doing it are excited about getting into transparency and traceability and using these principles, but looking at more of the illegal side of it and also using models from the global health space like social behavior change, like what makes a person change their norms? Like, what are the incentives? Why would they use these principles? How do you start looking at the traceability and accountability for that side? Like when we do it at black markets and medicine, I mean, it's a little bit harder just to be like, yep, here are some principles, when they're like, well, I've been doing it this way for 30 years. So just curious kind of that side of work that you guys have been doing.
Yeah, I will take that first. Yeah, it's certainly true that the principles are catered to people who are interested in doing traceability and want to know how. The principles are not meant to be a tool to change someone who is illegally trafficking people and fish and what have you in those international markets. And so I think what you bring up, though, is an excellent point, and part of the reason why we say that you have to have all stakeholders at the table, right? So a lot of the work that industry is doing globally when it comes to traceability is less so now, but was voluntary in nature initially, right? So there was traceability for food safety regulations. Now there are different regulatory frameworks. But a lot of people understood that consumers were driving demand, and that is why they were doing traceability. But without, so that one might call that the carrot, and without the stick of regulation and enforcement and verification against that illegal behavior, you are not going to be able to reach those parties as much. However, we do think that those levers work really well to be mutually reinforcing. If an end buyer, for instance, were to say, someone like, people even we partner with, but large retailers were to say, I need full transparency into my supply chain and I need to understand the source of that product, I do believe there's a lever in there to reduce illegal activity, I would say. But I'd love to hear from others your thoughts on that side of it.
Maybe just to add on that, I also think that illegal fishing is one of the main reasons that legal fisheries or the legal sector wants traceability. They're the main drivers, at least in Mexico, where illegal fishing is a big problem because they are seeing their stocks being depleted. They are seeing the market value of their product going down because they have to compete in the market with illegal products. So as you mentioned, it is not targeted for people who are doing illegal fishing, but illegal fishing is one of the main drivers, at least in Mexico, why the fishing sector really wants this, because they want to differentiate their legally, sustainably sourced product from the illegal one, which is not something we can currently do in these regulatory conditions.
And I'll just go ahead and emphasize, too, that, the importance of policy and regulation, as you said. And so to that end, NOAA is on the next panel. And, of course, the U.S. has its seafood import monitoring program. The EU has its own requirements. And so that would be something great to bring up then as well.
Great. Yeah, please, in the room first.
So I'm Jeff Wheeler. I'm the director of the Global Trace Protocol Project funded by the U.S. Department of Labor. We've certainly seen FishWise as a very important example and some good input from Sarah as well in the process. Okay. One thing I'm particularly curious about is sustainability, in the sense that you don't have a static product, but like what set of tools do you have here for traceability that will carry on beyond the life of the project? And again, you're dealing with a global industry. So some of this is actions by governments, but fish are global. So I'm particularly curious, as we're looking at developing our project, implementation, sustainability strategies, what pieces of this will exist beyond the life of the project, and how is that, what is that kind of the dynamic process for refining and implementing? Thank you.
Sarah, do you want to take that, or do you want me to?
I was going to let you start, and then I was going to carry on.
Okay. So great question. Thank you, and so happy to have you here. So FishWise will continue to utilize the principles and promote them. I think you'll see here on the tables, we, as a sort of learning element of we want to utilize, we want to review, we want to adapt and improve it moving forward. So in the short term for us, you will see the second version of the principles based on our learning with Tanzania and what we've heard from other partners. And FishWise intends to try to carry this work forward at least in the vein of the principles and pathway as much as possible. There's some elements of our work, like the Seascape, that found a home with a different organization, which is great. You know, that was a tool that's shared all globally where traceability projects are happening, and just a really good source of information. So we intend to have that information still available through FishWise, but really in specific examples like Tanzania or other places, we are looking to carry it forward. It's a matter of identifying resources to do so or partnerships to do so. But you know, we want this work to continue into the future. And as you said, sort of if there is a way in which we can continue to learn from the application, adapt it, improve it, that is very much so in the way we view all of our work, but in particular this work on the principles.
Yeah, and I would just. Am I not? Okay. I would just add that I think we have this momentum on some of these things that, and also some experience with the process of actually walking through the pathway itself. And we're just like, as Jenny was alluding to, really eager to continue utilizing that. And so we're looking for opportunities to work with other organizations, not even necessarily just applying it within specific governmental contexts, but we're also looking for partners to kind of continue to help us carry this forward. And that's part of why, I'm excited about the work that you all are doing. But I think in terms of the practical application, it's something that was so joyful, and in the Tanzanian and other examples, like the chance to get to see the work actually, move ahead in these specific examples is something that we're continuing to definitely pursue. And I think we're going to also commit to continue having gatherings of the community. So there's virtual events that will be continuing. I'm not sure how many we're committed to over the next year, but we're not letting the community dissipate. We're going to continue holding that and keeping the conversations going.
Yeah.
And Jenny, just to add a really important collaboration you all have had recently is with the UN FAO's Blue Ports Initiative. So the principles being taken up into that, and you can go online, the UN FAO Subcommittee on Fish Trade, background papers, traceability and catch documentation, SALT, and that collaboration are named in there. And so the principles are really getting used in broader formats like that then have global reach.
Yeah, so we are keen for them to move forward with partners, with ourselves. Yeah, we want to see this work continue. I see a question from online from Chris Williams from ITF. It says, I see how traceability can make fishing more sustainable, but how can it be successful in the labor dimension? How much consultation with workers, unions, and other worker orgs has SALT done? Great question, Chris. And we have been actually in consultation in different ways with ITF. I referenced a little bit earlier some work we did with Judy Gerhardt, who is a leader in this field. And she worked and discussed with lots of experts sort of whether or not traceability could be beneficial in the social space, right? We thought that there was potential, but what that looked like was unclear. And again, it is a tool that could contribute to identifying risk, but there is much more in that space that, frankly, FishWise is continuing to work on. But so I think some of the data pieces that we were talking about that could identify the potential for forced labor in supply chains are around time at sea, number of transshipment activities, but similarly, the idea of what we were saying as to the importance of having fishers at the table to talk about what information they need and what information they may want from such a system. You know, traceability may not be the right system to gather a set of information, but when you have government and fishers at the table and you can hear from them directly what their needs are in general, that's still a forum. And if that can happen in the, you know, in the guise of a traceability system, great. But if it's not in a traceability system, that's still an access point to make sure that their voices are being heard because they're at the table for those discussions. Any other?
Unionization was one of the things that came forward from Judy's work. Like, it's one of the KDEs or kind of umbrella topics that can be unpacked in the conversation. Absence or availability or legal
freedom of association.
Freedom of association is one of the things that she identified as an essential component that we should be looking at as part of thinking about seafood and supply chains and the information that needs to be exchanged about workers. But then also I would say, getting back to the earlier example, having, like you say, the fishers actually speak for themselves and always surprise everyone with what is most important to them. So Chris, to your point, we don't want to tell them what they care about. We want to ask them, and they'll tell us things that we hadn't even considered because we're not in their shoes. So that's really critical. And then even if it's not the right fit for a traceability system to address those needs, other agencies or other actors within the supply chain can at least have that awareness through those discussions and take that on through other avenues. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Hi, Mark Kaplan from Invisible. We talked a lot about holding accountability and to the supply side of the supply chain. Have you had any experience on, let's say, effective mechanisms for having the same accountability on the market side? In our work, we've had some instances where we've come across illegal activity in supply chains, connected those to markets, and then the market buyer doesn't care because the product is a nickel cheaper per pound than a sustainable product, or even a legal one for that matter.
You want to, you can, or Mariana, I don't know.
Yep. I think it's a battle we need to keep fighting. I consider that the origin of our food, or for seafood, or food in general, is not something we as a society care deeply about, but I think we're getting there by informing what happens. For example, in the high seas, we have seen like these factory vessels in the high seas, and as people get to know more and more about what's happening there and the importance of knowing where their seafood comes from, I think traceability is going to advance. I don't think we're there yet, and maybe there are other interests that could be closer to people's values and hearts. For example, we have seen in Mexico that consuming locally and from our own fishing communities is something that more and more people care now about. So maybe we need to start figuring out, as people that work in traceability and trying to promote legally and sustainably sourced seafood, what people care about. I know surveys are a great way to know that. We did one in Oceana in Mexico at the end of last year, and results were very impressive. About 80% of people wanted to know if their food was legally caught, if it come from local producers. So the more we talk about this, I think the more it becomes part of people's concerns and values. I don't think, as you said, we are there yet. Sometimes we look more at the value, especially, well, with this economy and people having economic struggles, but it doesn't have to be maybe more expensive. For example, in Mexico, consuming locally is cheaper and maybe more sustainable. So I think we need to find the path of what people care and what is entrenched in their set of values, and we're still figuring that out.
Also do related to price transparency. I know, Mark, like the Finding a Better Food Future project is getting its feet, but really in thinking about ways to make the actual true costs of traceability and the true cost of the product more transparent to everyone in the chain really can be helpful, because there are ways that we can actually implement traceability without necessarily increasing the overall cost at the end of the product. But we need to be able to talk about those things, talk about pricing and the real cost of things in a more transparent way to negotiate that across the supply chain, which isn't necessarily the norm. But it is something that I know folks like yourself are really trying out. So I think that's the way forward too.
Yeah, and I'll just say, maybe not as directly related to salt, but at FishWise, we work directly with retailers, and we have a due diligence process that we ask them to go through about making commitments, about verifying their purchasing practices as they go through the supply chain. So I think there are examples, but there should be more, for sure. So thank you. And great, our last question for Mariana and Jovis, and if you can see it, it says, as you look at the impacts of salt in your counterparts context, do you see any major differences or similarities in the way that salt's principles have helped your country's traceability efforts? Sorry.
Well, for me, I think the major difference is the fact that Tanzania's government was very involved in the process. Yeah. So I think that made the whole process very different. SAT was being able to work directly with the government and the people who are going to be in charge of implementing this regulation alongside with other stakeholders, such as the fishing sector. I think in Mexico it has been more of a struggle to get the government involved in this process, but at least this draft, which we hope it's going to become official, has some of these very important principles already set in there.
On my side, I think for SART, these other partners or counterpart have got principles, but for SART, the issue of inclusivity and the collaboration together with issue of social responsibility and human rights, for me, it's a major difference. As I said before, we have got a traceability system in place, but more we use it on the enforcement side for food safety and IUU. But on using this principle, I think fishers and other stakeholders from the ground, from the fishing ground, will be able to participate fully and see that traceability is their own source and not for the government side. Yeah, that is I think the difference which I see.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you to you wonderful panelists for all of the work you've done on salt and representing it so well here. And and thanks to everyone. I would be remiss if I didn't just acknowledge the SALT team who is in the room, who has put a ton of effort into making this event go really well with CSIS, Erin, Nina, Hanai, Kate, who you'll hear from later. Just thank you so much also for all of your hard work and dedication these last 6 years, and thanks to my panelists again. Thank you.
Oh, you put outside of it. I mean, that's the reality. Can you remember to bring in? I'll say I only supported this recently. I see everyone walking around their bottles, and I just started to observe it. I do a lot at the office. We get this big cooler for everybody. Right. So then I have my water from there. But I'm not figuring.
All right, I think we'll go ahead and reconvene here, folks. So again, thank you all for joining us here today, and thank you to everybody online. Hopefully everybody's back now on the live stream. And before we dive into our second panel, I'm really thrilled that we're going to open that with a little vignette, some opening remarks by Ian Urbina. Ian, for those who don't know, is the founder of the Ocean Project. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who has done landmark work reporting on and exposing systemic human rights abuses in the seafood supply chain at sea. He continues that work, and I could think of really no better person to talk about some of the continuing challenges that we face as we move into our next panel. So thank you, and we'll turn to Ian's remarks.
My name is Ian Urbina. I'm the director of the Outlaw Ocean Project. I'm a journalist. And first of all, I just say thanks to CSIS and the Seafood Alliance for Legality and Traceability for inviting me to give a couple comments. Look, most of you are the experts that I turn to guide me on what I should write. So I feel a bit humbled to offer my thoughts. In typical fashion to a journalist, I have more questions than thoughts. And if the panel that I'm sort of scene setting here is titled The Next Frontier of Seafood Traceability and Transparency, then a bunch of questions come to mind for me personally. If I was in the room, these are the things that I would most be listening for from you folks to hear how you discuss them. So the best I can do is run down those questions that would be of great interest to me, and maybe those will speak to you as the next frontier. One is this perennial question of whether the definition of illegal fishing in IUU should include human rights and labor, whether the fishers matter as much as the fish, and indeed whether we need to update how we approach the concept and the definition of the problem here. That's a big question for me. Number two, should organizations like NOAA or Marine Stewardship Council or Monterey Bay Aquarium, should these organizations still be okay with stating that they only focus on marine issues and they're not addressing human rights and labor issues? Is that okay at this stage when we know there are such problems in that part of the seafood supply chain? Another huge question is, should traceability data be public? Would the effort that you folks are discussing, the desire to fix certain problems through traceability, would it be better equipped if indeed entities other than industry and governments were allowed to access all this traceability data? Journalists from the Outlaw Ocean Project, unions like the ITF, organizations like Global Fishing Watch, should they automatically be able to access this information? And would we move the ball further downfield if we had more of an ethic of making this information public? And then, tracing and traceability matter a lot, knowing where things are coming from ship to reefer, reefer to port, and exporting. But knowing, I think the more important question isn't just being able to trace, but rather accountability and sort of when the traceability does reveal things that are problematic, how do we use that traceability data to actually achieve accountability? I think that's a huge question that interests me. Audit schemes and the sort of fundamental flaws with any regime that's set up where so much of the information that's being received is self-reported. Our audit schemes, as they exist presently, because they're relying on self-reported data most often, with very limited ability for independent and spot checking of that data, are these regimes giving the illusion of traceability and accountability rather than actual traceability and accountability because of the self-reporting nature of it all? what to do about places like China, just to be very blunt, settings where it's very difficult for NGOs or industry players or auditing firms or whomever or journalists to have any true access to what's going on, because as a condition of being there, many of the NGOs in the marine space have offices there and are somewhat self-muzzling so as to maintain their presence in these settings. But what consequence does that have for real accountability? And at some point, does that relationship become so fraught that it should no longer exist? And are we at that point with seafood? How is the problem of silos within government, data that comes into Customs and Border Patrol not being shared with NOAA, data that comes into NOAA not being shared with Department of State? Look at any government around the world and you're going to see these sort of silo problems. And I think that's a huge problem for the utility of traceability. The data comes in, who has it, how well are they handing it off to other players inside the government or outside the government? So these would be questions that I would love to hear this crowd discuss. And we'll be watching closely to see what smart ideas come out of those answers. Thanks for having me.
Great. So thank you again to Ian for those opening remarks. I think they were properly provocative and getting us to think about sort of the real stakes at play here. I talked in my brief opening remarks earlier about sort of the challenge of sustainability and the ways in which sort of our historical means of managing fisheries is not necessarily up to the challenge of a changing world. Particularly because of what happens in the dark, what happens in the places without transparency. But as Ian really highlights, it's not just about the fish, it's about the people as well. And it's about the people who are involved in the industry, it's about the people who are involved in the industry both at sea, but also on land, in the processing sectors, in the ports. And that we really need to think about this as a full loop. This isn't just something that is occurring in one part of the supply chain, but is occurring throughout the supply chain. And by this, I mean both illegality, but also human rights abuses. Illegality with respect to the fisheries. Which brings me to this second panel. We're looking ahead now. We're thinking about the next steps in traceability and transparency at sea. It was a wonderful opening panel. A great conversation about all of the work that is being done through SALT and to build up a set of principles and I think crucially mechanisms to implement those principles in various places around the world. And we heard some excellent comments from Jovis and Mariana about work in Tanzania and Mexico about how those principles are being implemented in place. But we need to look ahead and think about how can we both scale up that work but also move it and link it to all the other great work that's happening in this space as well. I've been doing this role here at CSIS now for 5 years. And before that, I was working on IUU in one form or another for the previous 10 years beyond that. So I've got more or less 15 years or so spending a good chunk of my time thinking about IUU fishing. And it's been wonderful to see the evolution in this space over that period of time. And one of the ways I think that we've evolved is obviously thinking about human rights abuse as a part of the systemic challenge that IUU brings us, but also to see the multitude of vectors and actors who are working to address that challenge. SALT is a great example of the kind of work that we can do to bring to bear attention and progress in this space. But there are other kinds of actors as well doing other kinds of related work in transparency and traceability. And so for me, one of the key watchwords I get out of the first panel is integration. And we heard a little bit about that from them, about the idea and the need to say integrate data types. It's sort of down to the smallest scale, a technical question of how can we integrate data and information from an artisanal fisher up to a local seafood market, up to a seafood processing unit, and then into a global market. How can we integrate data across those different, radically different scales and technology capability and capacity? How can we integrate that information across accountability regimes? How can we integrate that information between governments? How can, within a government, can we integrate information transfer? So anyway, that's just a watchword that I've been thinking about and I hope we can all think about as we move forward into this panel and a great set of panelists that we have here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly introduce each of them, and as with Jenny earlier, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves a little bit further as they give their remarks. So I'll introduce them briefly, and then we'll move through them and have them give some brief remarks, and we'll then move into questions from me and questions from you in the audience, if that's okay. So to my left, we've got, of course, Tony Long, who's the CEO of Global Fishing Watch. We've got Laura Van Voorhees, who's a team lead with the Bureau of International Affairs at the U.S. Department of Labor, and working specifically in International Labor Affairs, or ILAB. We've got Leo Pradella, who is a program officer with the Walton Family Foundation. And of course, Alexa Cole, who is the director of the Office of International Affairs, Trade, and Commerce at NOAA, our National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration here in the U.S. government. So thank you all. Really appreciate you deeply that you're here today. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Tony, to start us off.
Thank you. It was great to hear Ian's voice. Actually, we did some great work with Ian a few years ago to expose a huge amount of illegal fishing happening in North Korean waters. And it was his investigative journalism that allowed us to really put that out in the open. And we've seen change. If you look at our map, there's a drop in the fishing activity happening in that area. We estimate around 75% drop of the illegal activity happening there. So Ian's good work and that use of transparency is really driving change. It's quite strange. It's 11 years, almost the day that I left the Navy and joined Pew, actually. Worked at Pew Charitable Trust, working on their illegal fishing project. And at that time, nobody was really talking about transparency. That word wasn't really prevalent across the fishing governance piece, but it was started to be. Groups like Oceana, Environmental Justice Foundation, WWF, all had concepts about where transparency can be used. And Andy Sharpless, one of our founders, I think he said to me that sunlight's the best disinfectant. And that's really the background to where Global Fishing Watch is coming from. If the data is open and public, people can be held to account, but also people can see across lines to understand how each other are behaving. It generates trust. And that's where Global Fishing Watch came from, this idea that Google and SkyTruth would put this technical platform together, but the technology only goes so far. It needs something to push it, and that's where Oceana recognized the opportunity and created Global Fishing Watch. I'm hoping everyone in the room knows Global Fishing Watch and has at least had a look at the map. We're trying to make that map so easy to use that it needs very little training. You should be able to go into that map and have a good click around, draw up the different data sets that we have, and broadly understand what you're looking at. But we know that working with our country partners and NGO partners, we're taking a good feedback loop to improve what we're doing in order that we're presenting the data in a way that those insights are useful, that they can have an impact, that people can take that data forward themselves. The other thing I'm trying to do with Global Fishing Watch is not create a monster in itself. I really don't want to have like two people in Global Fishing Watch doing what many people here are already doing. So we're trying to put the data in the hands of the people that need it most in a format that they need. So you'll see through our website, many of the people in the room, actually, we've had some kind of liaison or partnership at some stage, and that data is just being amplified and extended through partnership rather than trying to create Global Fishing Watch as a central tenant for the information. The platform's there, the data's public, it's free to access, it always will be, thanks to our philanthropic supporters and increasingly government support, hopefully some news coming out of the UN General Assembly next week. And that's what we should be hooking into now. When I first arrived at Global Fishing Watch, there was some partnership with the supply chain. We had a bit of a discussion going on with Whole Foods. There was a group called Asdomar. And we were trying to put our data and our technology into their hands to say, you can do traceability and transparency through our data. But the timing wasn't in sync. I'm not a total expert in seafood chain traceability, but what was happening was each of the different firms had mechanisms for understanding their supply chain, but they weren't robust. And there's been a lot of work done in the past few years to build up mechanisms for that traceability to work. What we're seeing now with this increased interest in transparency, every conference and congress is talking about transparency now, the recognition that public data is creating insights that people understand, and the fact that there is a demand from the public to understand more than just who it was bought from and where it was going to. So I think Hugh Thomas talks to me about one up, one down traceability, where there might be a food safety reason to recall. Who did you sell it through? Who did you buy it from? Now people want to know the provenance of the food. Is there slave labor involved? Where exactly is it from? Is it ethically caught? Is it environmentally friendly? And I think that's what we've got to try and build on with the different tools and methods that we've got. And we're starting to see that connect up now. So whether we're working with Walmart Foundation or FishWise, there's a definite need and interest in bringing this data to bear. I just want to flag a couple of things that we're trying to do. So in the same way as I'm not trying to create Global Fishing Watch as a huge organization where there's just lots of people, we're trying to provide mechanisms for you to have that data. One of them was to create tools. So if you go to our website, you'll see things that allow you to look at the carrier vessels around the world, those vessels, carrier vessel portal, we call it. There's Marine Manager, which allows you to look into governance of marine protected areas and reserves. And there's also what we now call Vessel Viewer. And this started with some work with a group called Ocean Risk Resilience Action Alliance. We were trying to put the data into the hands of insurers in order that they would not insure vessels that had a history of IUU fishing. And what we very quickly realized is that same system can also be applied to the supply chain, hence the work with FishWise and Stanford and WEF now. And it can also be applied to finances within the banks, and there's some elements there. And it's also a port control tool. And we're seeing people in West Africa now using that to really advance their understanding of what a vessel's been doing out at sea. So you're pinpointing where these inspections should be, where there might be problems. And by making it public, you're driving two things: deterrence. They know it's going public, so their behavior changes, but also understanding, which allows you to act on where the problem points are. And that's the theory of change that we're trying to push. So I think that's probably enough for me at the moment, because there will be questions, and I'll hand over to the rest of the panel.
That was great. Thank you, Tony. Laura, we'll go ahead and turn to you, and I think you have some slides. So
oh, no, actually.
We're good? No slides?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, excellent. Well, Laura, we'll go to you then.
Thanks so much for having me at this panel and for talking about salt and looking ahead. I've had the privilege of being able to sort of see the evolution of salt over the years, and especially the conversation on labor, which I think is sort of reflective of a larger conversation happening in the industry. In the early days, in the wake of sort of reporting by Ian Urbina, I was able to be part of sort of industry conversations, working with Verite at the time, to try and understand how to grapple with a lot of these issues. So now working at the Bureau of International Labor Affairs, or ILAB, where we work on supporting the labor chapter of trade agreements, working on labor diplomacy, working on labor research. I get to continue to do this work in a different sort of venue. So I know that we've all heard of the horror stories of crew being kept at sea for prolonged periods. We know about modern day slavery, human trafficking, and debt bondage of workers that can happen on vessels. Millions of workers support themselves and their families through this important sector. And it's not just, as we mentioned, capture at sea, but also seafood processing, port workers, transportation. And their work contributes to the GDP in a huge way. Fishing is an extremely difficult and dangerous work. There are alarming fatality rates associated with it, 100,000 deaths per year, which can be caused by poor health and safety, conditions that can exist on commercial fishing vessels and processing plants and small-scale fisheries as well. Many of these workers lack the opportunity to organize or raise issues with employers to have remedy. Migrant workers, in particular, are particularly vulnerable, and they can be deceived at the recruitment stage and fall into debt and are isolated in forced labor conditions on board fishing vessels for months or even years at a time. They face threats of abuse, and this can amount to forced labor. We have seen child labor in national and small-scale fishery, from children conducting hazardous dives to working long hours on vessels. And we know that it takes coordinated action to address these issues. The Department of Labor is deeply committed to this work. We need to empower the very people who are being abused and victimized. Workers must be able to freely associate and form unions and have the right to have their grievances heard. This can be done by recognizing international labor rights of freedom of association and collective bargaining. These are commitments that all countries, as members of the International Labor Organization, or ILO, have committed to. Through our MAP-15 project, iLab is working with ILO to help develop a handbook to identify fishers at risk before, after, and during their employment journey. For those I work with, I've been talking about this handbook for a long time because we're excited about it, but I swear it is actually coming out within the next 2 months. And I've seen the sort of final version, so we hope to share it soon. But there are some really helpful tools for law enforcement, for connecting with workers, for conducting interviews, to take enforcement actions. So I hope it will be a useful tool that Coast Guards globally will be able to use. We need to understand our supply chains better to ensure due diligence and risks associated with potential violations are addressed. The panelists in the previous panel mentioned some of the risks that can be flagged, such as hours at sea, for example. A lot of the lessons learned that there's a lot of things we can learn from the work that's been done on the conservation side to address issues, and taking the same attention to labor is really critical. I already gave Ian a hard time for asking all the hard questions on labor and then leaving me to answer them, but I think that a lot of the issues raised are really important that Ian and that SALT and others have raised on this issue are really important to consider, especially as as technology and as tools to address these issues are improving. How can the labor piece be part of that? It's important to make sure that the voices of workers themselves are being heard in all these efforts, and that's why we work with civil society and trade organizations and partners, such as the International Transport Workers Federation, ILRF, ISRA Institute, and others that have direct lines of contact with workers. It's important to include workers in development of solutions, including codes of conduct, ideally co-creating binding agreements between workers and employers. I'd like to just take a moment to highlight some of the work that we're doing at Department of Labor to address these issues. We're engaging in labor diplomacy, undertaking research, important research, and providing technical assistance work. We are currently supporting $20 million worth of technical assistance work. One of such is the Decent Work in Fishing Project, which works in Peru and Ecuador to address illegal fishing and working with vulnerable communities and artisanal fishers. We're also partnering with the ILO, which is the one UN agency that works with employers, workers, and governments to bring light to these issues. We're working with NOAA to make sure that ILO speakers are part of the regional fisheries management organizations meetings and looking at how to address labor issues in those venues. We also have an important research in the iLab's list of goods produced by child labor and forced labor. As of September 2022, this included 20 countries and areas listed for fish and seafood, including listing China and Taiwan, flagged vessels for forced labor and distant water fishing fleets. iLab also plays an important coordination role for U.S. government IUU fishing. We work closely with the U.S. Trade Representative and the State Department to uphold and enforce labor obligations and trade agreements, including the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, which is the first trade agreement that has a complete ban on goods with forced labor, which includes seafood products. Another area, speaking about collaboration, where we're working across the U.S. government is with the Maritime Safe Act that brings together 21 agencies to address IUU fishing, including NOAA, U.S. State Department, Coast Guard, and others. We're also co-chairing a sub-working group on labor issues with NOAA and State Department there. So again, iLab is working to bring the eyes and ears of workers to address this issue and making sure that they're not in the margin, but in the center of these conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Leo.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. Leonardo Pradella and Leo. I spent most of my career on the forest side of things here in the U.S. and in many other places. More recently transitioning to the ocean side. There has been a very clear realization that many of the challenges, particularly on the traceability side and transparency side, are shared. Of course, in a different ecosystem, different biomes, but the challenges of implementations are not too distinct. So it's a privilege for me to be here and to speak with you. I appreciate the invitation from the organizers, from CSIS for hosting, and for the whole SALT team for organizing and carrying out the work over the last 6 years. I think this is a good moment in time to recognize and appreciate the progress that has been made in a number of different ways. We have evolved the technology capabilities that we have of understanding where things are, mapping where vessels exist, and what patterns they have in their behavior that are associated with illegal activities. We have been able to get groups together, governments, civil society, businesses, subnational governments to some degree, in aligning on the right principles and aligning on specific key data elements and what's important when it comes to tracing our supply chains, our seafood supply chains. And more recently, and I guess it's still in progress, there's collective understanding of goals that we can all aspire to eliminate forced labor and human rights abuses in seafood. SALT has played a very important role in advancing each of these challenges that I mentioned. So it's important for us, as I mentioned, to celebrate how far we've come. So what's next? This panel is looking ahead, right? That's the purpose of our discussion. So in my mind, I was thinking, so what's stopping us from just going to a restaurant or going to a grocery store and just scanning a QR code of a product and taking us back all the way to where that product, that seafood product, was caught and understand what happened along the way? So there are a number of things that need to be in place, right? A lot of things have to go right and very few things need to go wrong for us to have a lot of assurance in this. And I believe there are two key issues that we need to recognize. Right? And I guess it's not just the technicalities of it, but also the broader narrative when we talk about seafood traceability. One, of course, is seafood traceability system. Or any traceability system is only as good as the data that goes in, right? And thus, a number of the challenges that we heard in the previous panel, it's not so simple to implement, especially when you're dealing with supply chains that have a huge number of small-scale fishers, multiple points of aggregation across supply chains, challenging data systems that don't necessarily communicate with each other. So it requires a monumental amount of collective effort. Subnational governments, national governments, technology providers, civil society, to some degree, philanthropic support, and a number of different stakeholders to crack that. We have a few very great examples that we've seen. SALT has supported carry out a lot of those, but that is still a clear challenge for us to reconcile. And more important, the second issue, perhaps the most salient one, is that traceability and transparency, it's not the end itself. It's a means to an end, right? It doesn't assure legality. It doesn't assure sustainability of the ecosystems or the people that are involved in catching those products. The markets that rely on that type of data need to use it, not just ask for it. We see a lot of commitments from different seafood companies involved in the supply chain that require traceability, but how do we make sure that that data doesn't just end in a system that doesn't make use of it? And for governments, of course, if we know what's important, and I think we do, there's no need for different governments to ask different things, right? Of course, they all have their own national priorities, but when it comes to traceability being used to eliminate forced labor on seafood, I think we can all be asking similar things. So, and I'll just conclude here by stressing what I guess I just mentioned on it. Traceability is not an assurance. It can be used if used properly, but I think we need to reassess how we talk about this, right? It's a mean, use it. It's how you use the data much more so than how you collect it and the systems that help us get us there. So I'm looking forward to the discussion and thank you again for the invitation.
Great, Leo. That was just perfect. Thank you. Alexa.
Thanks,
Thanks, and thank you for having me here today. It's always a pleasure to get to talk about these issues that I spend too long thinking about way into the early hours of the night. And I know Whit said that we're supposed to be looking forward here, but obviously we know the past informs the future. And so I've been thinking about IUU fishing, unfortunately, longer than Whit, despite how very young I am. And there were days where, when you think back to why we have the description of IUU fishing in the IPOA, IUU, and why we even have that, and it's because we were in desperate need of a terminology. We were in desperate need of a way to talk about this collective set of issues in fisheries governance, and we needed something to call it. And once you name it, then you can start to address it and you can start to deal with it. And in my early days, my background was as an enforcement attorney at NOAA, and there were days where we were just like pounding on the door to get people to let us in to talk about enforcement, because everyone wanted to talk about other sides of fisheries management. Some days I feel like perhaps we have succeeded too well, and I wish a few less people cared about IUU fishing on some days when the emails won't stop, but we've succeeded. It's right, we now have a common terminology, we all talk about it, and we heard the question from Ian of, is it time for IUU fishing definitions to include labor issues? And I've actually gone on the record in a lot of places of saying no, but it is, because I think it's the wrong question, frankly, to be asking. Because it isn't about what we define IUU fishing as. What I think it is because that obscures the fact that I think we have a common agreement that these are critical issues in fisheries governance that we need to address. But I actually, and I don't know what it is, I wish I did, but I actually think it's almost time for a new term, that we need a new term that is going to be broader than just the fisheries governance side of it, but is going to include these social sustainability issues. And the reality is, in some ways already, the term IUU fishing is too broad for what we really care about. And that, to me, is where we, in terms of traceability programs, we care about all the issues involved in IUU fishing, but when we think about traceability, when we think about what pieces of seafood do we not want to be on your dinner plate today, it doesn't actually connect to everything that's in IUU fishing. And because IUU fishing is about unreported fishing, it's about unregulated fishing. And so it can include things, and the example I always use is when somebody submits their record keeping late. In the United States, you have to submit your logbooks within 72 hours of landing in most cases. And if you submit it 100 hours after landing, nobody really minds having that on your dinner plate if you have that piece of fish. But the terminology captures that. And so what I've been spending a lot of time thinking about is maybe we need to redefine the problem set in a little bit, because it needs to include some more things, such as these labor issues. It needs to include how do we use the market. It needs to include how do we get the public to care, and not just broadly, but specifically. How do we get them to care about buying this piece of fish versus that piece of fish? And then it also needs to care about the illegal fishing or unregulated, unreporting fishing that is really problematic. But there's a universe outside of it that it's not that it doesn't matter, it's just that it's not critical to this issue. And so as we think about it, and my office runs a program some of you care about called the Seafood Import Monitoring Program, as well as 3 other trade monitoring programs. And we're really struggling with trying to make sure that that program is effective and meaningful. And we struggle with it because the United States is a huge market. We import an enormous amount of fish. It isn't like drugs where I can just see on the face of it that this is illegal. And so, this future of traceability is keeping me up at night, because I'm really trying to say, I need to figure out better what the problem is. I need to figure out a new terminology for it. And then we have to figure out what are going to be the right tools to fix it. And I, to be perfectly honest, don't think we've gotten that right yet. And so we're really thinking about the future of traceability. We're thinking about it in our own program. So I'm pretty excited to be here with all of you and hear your thoughts and your ideas, because I'm certain I don't have all the answers, but I'm hopeful that collectively we may find the solutions to this.
Great. Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists for remarks. Really all great, and each one of you raised points that I'm like really anxious to come back to. But I want to start, I think, here with something that Leo said that really caught my ear, which is the idea of transparency and traceability as a process, and not really what we're trying to achieve. And some of you know I wear another hat. In my other job, I teach marine policy at the University of Rhode Island. And I always am talking in that context to students about the idea of process versus outcomes, and how we can get wrapped up in, to use another comment, a lexicon wrapped around process rather than wrapped around outcomes. And transparency and traceability, two words which I think we use interchangeably but which are not, and we should be clear about that, are processes. And I thought that was a great point. But Tony, you talked about how you have been very successful relatively recently of tying tools, process tools, to specific needs and outcomes. And so I guess maybe what I'd ask to the panel is, can you talk about, from the perspective of your own individual programs, of examples of successes in tying the process of transparency and traceability to outcomes? And do you think that there is a way that we can better do that more intentionally? Is this something that should be driven primarily by need, by customers essentially coming to Global Fishing Watch? Or is this something where we can be saying, creating a market, if you will, which is kind of like what I think maybe SALT has been doing, of creating a market for these tools? So anyway, I'll throw that out there. I hope that was clear. Whoever wants to start. I'll push Tony's button because you've been doing it lately. So how have you been successful in linking? The vessel viewer is a great example of something that you've found opportunities to have more than one use for that sort of thing.
Yeah, I've been training myself not to jump in. So thank you for letting me jump in.
Yeah.
So it is a journey. I mean, the thing is, there's very rarely something you can do that fixes it. And there's a whole set of things happening at the same time, some happening faster, some happening slower. Sometimes you get to a point where you have to wait for something to catch up. It's no different to leadership in a team. When you've got an international team, different cultures, different languages, different approaches to work. It doesn't matter how clear your own vision is. If you don't bring the team with you, you leave people behind and something doesn't happen. So transparency and open data is one really clear mechanism of trying to get people onto the same page. If the data is open and clear, it's very clear when you come to a sort of buying and selling relationship, you can start to check into what you're being told. Is it broadly correct? Okay, I've got some faith in this data, and you can move forward with that relationship. If you're an agency that generally doesn't have access to data because it's expensive in the round, you need some kind of system to even understand what's happening out in your area and try and hold people to account. So I think the first big step forward in order to come up with a globally scalable, affordable, accessible, equitable system sits on that transparency piece. And I think that's where I didn't quite finish my point in my opening, is that only 5 years ago, no one was really talking about transparency, but now they are. And people are starting to see some of the returns. So Ina Bina's example is a really good one. That was 1,000 vessels fishing illegally in North Korea. There was the squid fleet operating close to Galapagos, which was on the high seas. There was a lot of reporting that this was an illegal fleet. It wasn't illegal, it was unregulated. It was not regulated, and therefore, when you provide the information to someone who really knows the system, they sort of reject the initial approach because you're saying illegal, and they go, it's not illegal. And therefore, the conversation's closed. You've got to give the facts as they are. So again, the open data allows us to unpick that, and over the space of 3 months, we showed what that fleet actually consisted of. There was illegality in it, but it wasn't about the squid fishing. It was potentially around CITES, potentially about maritime pollution, potentially about unauthorized transshipments, and things like that. So it's like a technicality. So again, in order for the process to work, there has to be a basis for change. And that's where I would put transparency.
Laura, I'd love for you to comment, especially given the programs that iLab has been running. You brought up your programs in Central America and how you're working to, again, kind of maybe it's create the market. Am I making a good analogy there, a metaphor for that? In terms of creating a market for a process that can lead to outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind when you talk about the importance of process for me, and was already raised by a number of panelists in the previous panel, is just how are you involving workers? There's been so many things done in the name of workers, but it's really important to involve workers in the process of doing that and to work with unions and worker representation to be able to do that. And I mean, it's hard to pick one thing because that's at the center of a lot of what we do. But I mean, to pick up the example of our technical assistance work, just working with workers who are being impacted by IUU fishing, as well as workers who are on board those distant water fishing fleets, and working with worker organization and representative organizations to figure out the solutions to that and see, you know, how to address that, working across with government, with those worker organizations and with employers is really critical to making sure that those solutions are something that are ultimately serve workers.
Right. So making sure that right people are part of the process is as critical as thinking about anything else in this equation.
Exactly.
Yeah. How about you, Leo? What would you say?
The one that comes to mind is, just as we are in this room always speaking English, imagine if we weren't talking different languages. It would be harder, more expensive for sure, for us to have translation. We are making progress in a similar vein when it comes to traceability. Many people involved or sitting in this room here today and those watching have been involved in unpacking or defining the right language in which traceability should communicate. There's a global dialogue on seafood traceability that have defined the specific criteria in which systems should talk to each other. And when it comes to implementing, I guess if I'm getting right to your question, what's a success that we can see there? If you go into a seafood distributor here in the US, anyone that sell to multiple different retailers, each one of these retailers or each one of these different seafood food service providers ask for something a little bit different through a slightly different system. If you're a distributor, you have to keep a tab for each one of these. Sometimes a different data provider that you need to use, a different software, each one with a different annual subscription fee. You have to figure it out because you want to sell to all of those. If they all ask similar things or they all can communicate to each other, you don't need 5 different data providers, you just need one. Right? And then they can compete in some other ways, and how effective they are, what the customer support are, and things to that effect. So that has been, we're still a long way from having like a fully integrated system that talks with all of them, but I think we're making progress, and I think it's a win that we need to account for in seeing the market reducing the cost of driving these types of traceability programs to a scalable way, which we can, you know, just not just communicate with each other, but also verify the origins of the products themselves.
What do you think, Alessa? Process versus outcome. How are we doing?
Well, I live in process. I'm the government. We're here to help, and we live in process. But every once in a while, we try to break out of some of the constraints of government. And one of the ones, and Laura's been working with us on this, is the ComSeas initiative that we have, which is a really nice acronym for a really awkward thing, which is the Collaborative Accelerator for Lawful Maritime Conditions in Seafood. This is one of the things we got ComSeas before what the word stood for, what the letter stood for. But it's been really interesting because I live in the fisheries world, and this has brought in our labor colleagues, and from environmental NGOs that I'm more familiar with labor NGOs, with businesses, with academics coming in, and all of a sudden there's just such a brighter light on what the problems are and the process is. We don't even speak the same languages. And so this is a 15-month initiative, and we're about halfway through, and we're just figuring out how to talk to each other, but starting to see how does this connect in. And so all of a sudden we're starting to really be able to say, okay, here's some of the key pressure points. I mean, Laura's correct. You know, we do way too much talking about workers and not enough talking to workers or letting workers talk for themselves. And that's certainly true in the fish world where the fish don't speak, so we're not used to letting anyone else talk. But then also trying to figure out these supply chains. How do we make the market work? And there's you're hearing it in all of these pieces. It is a process chain. But finding the small successes along the way that I think we're starting to get there is starting to sort of light up the other hot spots where we know we can make some changes. And so I think I'm not willing to call it a success yet, but it's been hugely informative. And I think already the folks of us who live in the fish world are thinking about these issues differently. I think the folks that live in the labor world are thinking about it differently because they now understand the fishing aspects. And to me, had we not had some of these conversations, we wouldn't have a clue where to go. It's, you know, it's made it so much clearer how to start to work together to find the solution. So maybe not success yet, but on its way.
Okay, that's good. All of you have mentioned terminology or lexicon, which I think is great. I'm also a big fan of recognizing that sometimes it's just about making sure we're all saying the same thing. And a lot of times we're all saying the same thing with different words, and that can operate, again, at different scales. That challenge can operate at different scales. But I want to harp again on a point that I think Leo made and Alexa made too, that common approaches are critical. And I think we have with salt an example of kind of a bottom-up, well, it's sort of a mix, I guess I would say, of working with producer countries to create agree upon a set of principles for traceability within their local supply chains that can then be sort of carried forward into the broader global supply chain. But there's a role for market states clearly as well in setting common principles, common standards and approaches. And in fact, we now have each of the three major global markets, the EU, the US, and Japan, all have market access control mechanisms, though all differ quite significantly in how they're applied and what they're applied to, and in the means of enforcement and accountability. So I guess I would love each of your perspectives on how we drive a movement towards a common lexicon for principles. And it's a little bit of there's no right answer here, so I'm warning you ahead of time. But the idea of, are we looking at a bottom-up system where 1,000 flowers bloom? Are we looking at a government market-driven demand side process? What's your thoughts on kind of the best approach here for moving towards a common lexicon for traceability, transparency principles? Leo, I'll hit you first because you brought it up in your remarks.
All right. I wish I had the answer for that. That would definitely help. I think you touched on many of the, I think on all of the things that need to work on a similar pace. There are many challenges of implementing different systems across different places, right? You mentioned also you're referring to import control rules that US, Europe, and Japan has. Japan much more recent, we just saw that last year. See, in the earlier stages, the US has a more robust and just expanded late last year. So we see more of that. Of course, it protects the consumers of those markets for the things that they care about. It cares about, but it also can create, as you expand these systems, for requirements that spill over more broadly. That is the theory, right? That by having these different mechanisms, you simply you allow producing markets to fully be prepared for these types of requirements more broadly. I think we need to have a very clear realization that, or understanding that implementing or being compliant, for example, with SIM is not quite so simple, right? You need to work with the producing countries, and they are not all in the same pace. They all have different political cycles and priorities that they need to accommodate as well. And so I think there is a point on working in specific markets, specific supply chains that have a greater volume, that have a greater exposure to some of these risks, but also on the demand side for us to make sure that we're constantly edging a little bit further in the number of species that are under threat or have higher risk of IUU, making sure that the technology adoption is fomented and promoted by these markets altogether. As I said, I don't have the answer, but it's a combination of all of these. There's a limit to how much voluntary markets and voluntary commitments are able to do. When that ends or when that plateaus, and we may be getting closer to that plateau, that's when the stronger regulatory environment, governance, and governments will be in a better position, or will have to take that responsibility for themselves to carry out this work. Right? There's no competing in markets for non-illegal products, non-human rights abuses. It's a very clear gradient of black and white there. You either have these issues in your supply chain or you don't. You compete on other things, and that's where governments come in to set that bar and hopefully set the bar higher and higher. So I would say it leans much more on that side than on the markets, but of course, one doesn't work without the other.
Alexa, you've been critical of SIMP. I understand that. And I don't want to get into sort of the ins and outs of some of the specific critiques. Maybe what I will say is, can you talk a little bit to how NOAA is working to advance the idea of these principles for market access with partner countries abroad, and how maybe through the Maritime Safe Working Group and others, collectively the U.S. government is thinking about how to advance the idea that we do have these principles with our partner nations and with the folks who are feeding into our market here in the United States.
And I want to be clear, I'm not critical of SIMP. I run SIMP. I'm really supportive of the team. I'm really supportive of the work of SIMP. I think there has been a mismatch in the expectations for SIMP and what it is capable at this point of achieving. But I think it goes to, just to follow on a little bit from Leo's point before getting fully to that question, which is there's always the concept that more information is better. And I love information, and you think of that a lot. But what happens is that sometimes the more information you have, the harder it is for people to meet those information needs. The more these systems become issues where we are tagging people for not giving the information, as opposed to being able to say, but your shipment was problematic because there was illegal fishing in the catching, right? That's one of the challenges we've had with SIMP, which is how to not be just prosecuting paperwork violations in your failure to answer the data elements, and actually be able to be prosecuting violations where there was illegal fishing that happened in advance. And that's what we're struggling with, so that we're asking the right questions. I think there is a tipping point. We're asking for too much information. You're buried in information and you're not able to focus, and you're missing the forest for the trees. So I think that's one of those challenges with the data, and I don't know where the sweet spot is, but I don't think we're hitting it exactly yet in our program. But I also think there is a tendency to think that there will be a silver bullet, and that's what we know there isn't. I mean, that's the whole theory behind Maritime Safe, where they brought together 21 federal agencies. The only reason you bring 21 federal agencies together is because we understand, and there's a recognition that this problem takes lots of different people from lots of different angles working to solve it. And that's what Maritime Safe is all about, trying to say, okay, the Navy is doing this, and the State Department's doing that, and the Department of Labor is over here, and this collectively together is going to help us address this issue. And so, you know, that's been one of the big challenges, and that's been one of my focuses since my office hit so many of those different pieces, trying to remind the world that we have a lot of different tools. How can I get my tools all sort of, I don't know, to make a bad metaphor, digging in the same direction or something, so that they're working towards something, and that no single tool is expected to save the world and do it all. And so that's been one of our challenges, and data is a key piece of it. How do we share it within the agencies? How do I share it within my programs? How do we share it with other governments? How do I share it with the market? How do I share it with the public, right? Those are all huge challenges. And so, you know, we're still looking for that solution.
Laura, how do you think your technical assistance program, or maybe a better question, what sort of feedback when you are working on your technical assistance programs are you getting from your partners? Are people thinking about more about sort of local standards and the kinds of work they need to do for local sort of supply chain loops? Or are they, when you're working on this technical assistance and implementing these principles, are they thinking about how do we then mesh with the broader global market? What's your experience there? Where's their focus on what they're trying to do?
It's implemented by the International Labor Organization. So they're, you know, we have a good set of principles for labor standards. We have the fundamental principles of rights of work. We have the Convention on Fishing, C-188, that's developed through a tripartite process with governments, worker organizations, and with employers. So we have some really great, you know, international tools and standards to look at that have been developed through a collaborative process. It's just a matter of how to implement those and how to use those and how to see the risk associated with them in labor space. So one of the things that the ILO handbook is doing is taking the flags for forced labor issues, breaking them down, showing where those are in the conventions, where they're mentioned, and how do you identify those when you're doing inspections aboard vessels? How do you identify those when you're doing interviews with workers? How do you take enforcement action? And just to follow on to some of Alexa's points earlier, I mean, I think one of the areas that being part of the Maritime Safe working groups and enforcement activities is where you really see the need to understand where each agency and each player is bringing and contributing to ensuring that our global supply chains are not illegal in their fishing practices and their labor practices and their human rights practices, a number of different issues. And I think through those through actions and enforcement activities, we're learning more about how that can apply to sort of the market as well and traceability schemes. And it's sort of the supply demand of that. How are you preventing bad actors from getting into the supply chains, and how are you thinking about how to cultivate good actors, being able to use that and how forwarding good processes.
Great, thank you. I'm going to do one more question here before we turn to the audience here and online, and that's just because I didn't want to leave this out there. I think it was important to come back to, which, again, this idea of lexicon and the power of language, and Alexa's point that maybe we've kind of moved beyond this concept of IUU as we've conceived it, and that we're trying to broaden the definition when maybe we should be thinking bigger than that. I'm not sure I 100% agree with that, but I wanted to, I respect the point tremendously and think it's an interesting one, because we have, I think the idea is the same in that things have changed quite a lot over the last several years. When we stood up SIMP in 2016, again, Seafood Import Monitoring Program for those following at home, I remember very specifically, being at the White House and, USAID over in the back sort of jumping up, hey, what about us? There's human rights issues that are involved. And, and us sort of saying like, yes, we know, but we can't quite deal with that yet. And yet here we are now, 7, 8 years later, and very much, boy, were they proved right. And we were sort of, did not have enough foresight. And so I think the point is that this is really an evolved conversation, or an evolving conversation, not even getting to the national security part of the conversation. But that doesn't obviate the fact that within government systems, so much of what we do is actually driven by the lexicon, by the literal mandates that we have from Congress, the regulations that are developed by agencies, and that those mandates and regulations and rules drive action fundamentally. We can do really cool things like ComSeas, which are happening sort of outside of a specific necessary mandate, or do technical assistance and Maritime Safe Working Group conversations. But ultimately, if we're going to enforce against things, against bad acts, we have to be enforcing against very specific elements of the lexicon. So I guess I might throw it back to you all to say, good that we want to do something new and big and better, but how do we do that without moving past our existing mandates, without changing what those mandates say, without changing that language?
I'm going to jump in on this one. There's 1,000 things I want to say to try and deal with that lexicon. If you go back to my military days, you had to envisage a time when you couldn't talk to each other on the ships or between aircraft, in order to coordinate the battle. And I'm being careful with the analogies because obviously it's like a military analogy, but what we haven't got in this world is a doctrine on how to combat IUU fishing. We do have ocean governance as a general word, but what is governance? It's different in so many different ways. So without that global doctrine, we have to do things slightly differently. One of my military leaders, once I went to him and said, look, the military fence doesn't work. It's costing us £40 to buy a light bulb, when I can go to that shop over there and buy it for £2. But the system meant I had to go through this system, and we added all the people in it, you end up with this £40 light bulb. It's a famous sort of story in the sense of the way ministries work. What we have all got to do is work out what systems are there within this lexicon and make it work to the common good. So I think Pew talk a lot about the Port State Measures Agreement, the CL 188, and the Cape Town Agreement. 3 separate pieces of work that, if each applied properly, would have a huge shift on how things happen out at sea. So whether it be just improving labour, or the ability to see what a vessel is doing, or hold a vessel to account when it's coming to port. All of those 3 things come together in just 3 agreements that need to be unpicked a little bit, but they're held by different organisations. And those organisations, although they've got UN in front of them, still aren't actually working together. And I think that's the challenge we've got to do. So I think my answer to the lexicon problem is communication. And that communication has to be loud and open. And we have to hold people to account and show how these different elements can be used differently in order to have a positive effect on governance. And then what you hope over the period of 5 years, things will join together a little bit, and then you have a more consistent, more joined together system, and then you evolve. Look back 10 years where we were, no one believed we would be here, but we're here. So in 10 years' time, it's going to be in a different place again, and we have to attack those problems in that way.
Go ahead.
Well, I think Tony just sort of hit the nail on the head about the lexicon issue, which is right. So, and that's been one of the reasons why I feel like there is this need for a different terminology. If you think about IMO, ILO, and FAO, right, those are the three organizations. Well, the terminology of IUU fishing only lives in one of them. And so, trying to fit ILO terminology into that one is awkward. I mean, so in my view, I feel like we hamstring ourselves where we tie ourselves to one agency's terminology or one federal government's terminology. None of Laura's statutes say IUU fishing, right? And so that's where you say, well, maybe there is some new way to talk about this that connects us all. Because one of the things that I get asked all the time, someone says, can you give me the site for the provision that prohibits IUU fishing? And I say, well, that's the Magnuson Act and the Lacey Act. And because there is no prohibition that says you may not conduct IUU fishing. That doesn't exist. It's the whole realm of fisheries management. It's capturing a whole universe of things. And so you can't pinpoint it, but it's a whole statute. And there's nothing in the labor statutes and there's nothing in the trade statutes that talk about IUU fishing. And so finding a way to connect ourselves with some language that we can then spread to all of the agencies or all of the international entities that can then have common ownership, I think that's sort of the key to success. I don't know what that word is. I don't know what that term is, but that's what I think would help unlock some of these doors and make us able to work more effectively across the various domestic agencies and international agencies.
Laura, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't think I can come up with the right term, but I think the efforts that Alexa's pointing to and the one we've talked about more, I mean, I was part of the interagency effort to do the first ever global Magnitsky Act action against two Chinese fishing vessels conducting IUU fishing. And it's the first one addressing labor rights. Mm-hmm. So, did we change the terminology through that process? I'm not sure, but we did find a way to work together to act towards something and to sort of use a tool in a new way that had never been used before. And I think that, I work on technical systems work. I think it's through those actions and through that collaboration that we'll get to a point where we can figure out what the right terminology is. But I think that it's just doing work, talking together, working together, finding ways to bring those things to take actions, enforcement, or market actions to address those issues in a meaningful way.
Leo, last word, anything on lexicons?
See, very briefly, from the market side of things, it's there's a challenge, of course, of each organization that deals directly with consumers to try to fix or try to address these issues across their own supply chains. It's their responsibility, and they need to acknowledge that, of course, and recognize, but also understanding what's important to their end consumer, right? I'm sure if we survey outside this building what IUU means to people that buy buy seafood products, it won't mean that much. But if you ask more broadly on sustainability, okay, that's starting to resonate. So I think there's a communication aspect of it. How do we make sure the things that we're asking when it comes to combating IUU can be used by businesses to advance the purposes that they have of doing business, but also a recognition of, as I mentioned, on responsibility, that yes, it's their supply chain to deal with. Some of these challenges that we're talking about are well beyond a single supply chain, or well beyond a single company's ability to address and intervene. And so certain things you need to do on your own, but a lot of the things you need to do collectively. And so whether it's refining how we talk about these issues, refining what the specific nomenclature, the specific language that we relate to talk about IUU, I think it's a part of it. but it's still, it gravitates to me on the responsibility of businesses to recognize this is important, whether a consumer understands this or not, right? This is about my own business and the things that I need to do to keep the supply chain away from these legal or illegal activities that may exist there.
Great, thank you. All right, we have some time for questions in the room or online. Do you have any questions in the room?
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Aldo Simon. I'm a commander in Italian Navy. I'm pivoting my career to ocean prosperity and security. So, building up from the lexicon issue and going from a helicopter view to, let's say, a spaceship view, if we perform an orbital scan of the planet, we see a planet that's going through global warming, resources are dwindling, and there is a fight for resources, and we are entering also an era of great power competition. So, under this perspective, how do we see traceability, human labor issues, human rights? Should they be part of this great power competition? Is it good to have them part of a bigger political discourse, trying to avoid a tragedy of the common? Or is it better to keep them out of that and trying to look at from a different perspective and building on common lexicon and collaboration and interoperability, etc., with the risk that other countries, in the classic prisoner dilemma, don't do that and take advantage of the situation and our goodwill. So I would like to hear your different opinions, or the same opinion maybe, about this. Thank you.
Very good question. I mentioned national security briefly earlier, but we haven't spent a great deal of time on that today, but of course, that's why we're talking about it here at CSIS, is that this is increasingly entering the national security sphere as a set of issues. And, I want to hear from the panel about this idea of, are we hurting ourselves by conflating these issues with national security, or is that just a reality that we need to grapple with? Tony, I'll turn to you first.
No, it's definitely a case of national security, but it's actually international security, and that's the challenge. It's that dichotomy between a country trying to protect its own resources against the reality is the planet needs to come together at this stage. We're a little bit off it at Global Fishing Watch at the minute, but one of the things we're about to do is embark on a mission to map all human activity at sea. So we're saying all.
Good, you guys are starting small there.
Yeah. Well, the point is, it's almost like the point I made before, in the sense we can deal with fishing in any one piece, but then immediately you're looking at these other factors that fishing encroaches on. So if you build a wind farm, how does that actually impact the fishing communities? Does it act as a fad, as in like it attracts the fish, or does it act as something else where they get confused, they don't know where they are? What are the impacts? And if we really want to understand what human activity is out at sea, we have to have more data. So we're going to map all shipping, all industrial activity when it comes to fishing. Most of the major small scale we start to look at. We'll look at all the dark vessels, those vessels that you can't see, and map those out so you can see the pattern of where there's a shipping and fishing impact. But we're going to add to that aquaculture. We're going to add to that wind farms and oil and gas. And hopefully, and probably seabed mining, just to have a look at that. Because these things we need to understand the interaction of those. It's going to take us 3 years to do it, to turn the map into that sort of thing. But if with that data available, then you can start to see what is truly happening. And maybe that's the conduit to get countries to talk to each other as they realize the impact of other people's actions on theirs, whether it be fish stocks moving north and south, or whether it's global warming that means fish stocks are disappearing. That one thing can be very good for the planet, but equally, if it's not done properly, it can be bad. So I think in the sense of that national security, we need to try and bring the national security down to nobody's national security will work if the planetary security doesn't. We're all on the same chunk of rock floating around, whatever we're floating around. So somehow that utopia of people coming together has got to be what we aim for.
Others? Maybe turn a handle it so well.
I mean, I would agree. These issues, ocean governance issues and fisheries issues and climate issues, they're existential for so many countries in the world, if not all of the countries in the world, but some more quickly than others. And so I think if you don't include that as part of the conversation, then you're just putting blinders on and not recognizing the scale and scope of the issues that we're trying to get to. Yeah. So I think it's an essential part of the conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, global supply chains are global, right? I mean, you're going to deal with those issues, the governance issues throughout any kind of supply chain. And it's important to find the leverage points for being able to address those issues. I mean, we work very closely with the U.S. Trade Representative to address labor issues in our trade agreements. There's more and more enforcement tools that we are coordinating with other agencies, the WROs, for example, the Global Magnitsky Act, other actions that are leverage points to addressing some of these bigger issues and making sure that the conservation issues and the labor issues and all those issues, the security issues, are part of that conversation.
My own brief view, I do want to get to some other questions, is that it is an issue of the commons, and it is an issue that we should all be collectively working forward together and making the case for that. And I think that from an optimistic point of view, that offers a reason for being hopeful about progress in these spaces, because it is so clearly in the benefit of all of us to move together in these issues. On the other hand, there are also clearly bad actors, both independent actors, but also state-sponsored actors in this space. And we can't ignore that and have to think about that in that context. So, next question. This is from online. What is needed to further increase consumer side demand for demand side for more traceability in the context of human rights abuses that are effective enough to justify potential increased cost passed on to the consumer? In other words, can we get a good signal from consumers that they care enough to make this happen?
There.
Yeah.
I think there are two pieces of that question, right? One is a recognition of what's the true cost of the product, right? If what we see on the label today is subsidizing, or is being subsidized by illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, that's one thing, and we need to be very clear about that. There's the other one of who is responsible and where does the cost is accrued in the supply chain, and how much of that can be passed on to a consumer, right? If we're talking about seafood here, like for a consumer, what are the options that they have? Some people like seafood, some people like other types of protein in their diet. It has to be put into context, right? Passing every expense along to a consumer, there's a risk that you're simply going to have to, make compromises in your bottom line. And so, does this challenge of the solution that we're aspiring to has to make sense at scale? It has to make sense for everyone. It has to make sense in a way that doesn't double the price of a seafood product. Otherwise, people are not going to buy it, and these issues are not going to go away just because of it. And so, it's that wider recognition of we need to have see advances in all of these different areas that the panel talked about. Similar language, technology being promoted, governments taking action in cracking down on some of these activities. All of these, everything has a cost ultimately, right? And in piece of the supply chain, a consumer is not ready to accommodate all of those, and definitely not all of those at once. And so we need to be thoughtful when we think about, driving pushing all of these expenses into the end of the supply chain. We need to have a clear recognition of who is responsible for what, how much does it cost, and what are the tools, what are the innovations that we can deploy that drive these costs down for these solutions to be to have a widespread adoption.
Thank you. I think it was Sarah in the first panel that talked about the idea of how the costs can be spread across the supply chain and not just in one piece of it as well. So we have one question here, and then maybe we'll take one more question online, and then I think we'll close it up. So.
Thank you. I'm Barbara Best. I'm a former senior advisor at USAID, and I had the privilege of working with our foundation partners to start this initiative called SALT. I want to go back to this question that was about the global commons and competition for resources, because I think it's critical. if you look globally around here, everybody realizes how important oceans and fisheries are to food security. But globally, that's not the case. Even if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, number 2, zero hunger, commitments there are much bigger than on oceans. And even here in the US, our expenditures for wild-caught fisheries is much less than we do domestically and internationally on wild-caught fisheries. So the question is, why is there this disconnect between people realizing that land-based crops are important to fish, or to food security, but fisheries are not? And how do we reverse that? If you're talking about scaling up traceability and addressing illegal fisheries, we need people to understand that fisheries are important to food security, and is our national security needs, it's the security needs for many developing countries. How do we do that?
Great question. I wish we had a voice from state here who could speak to some of their work in this space. But maybe Alexa, I'll start with you because that's one of the missions of NOAA is to talk about how important seafood is as part of both our economy here, but also food security.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a critical issue. Sorry, I lost you, Barbara. It is a critical issue, and I think that we are continually challenged by how do we connect with the market? How do we connect with the public well enough on these issues that we're able to really, I hate to keep saying things come back to terminology, but they do. I don't think our language about this is as good as it could be, but NOAA is working towards that. We've recently issued a new seafood strategy. There's also a new export strategy issued by the Department of Commerce that for the first time has a seafood chapter in it, trying to do a better job of connecting these fisheries issues to the sort of seafood industry, to the marketplace, and being able to make, tie these all together to the environmental challenges that we're facing related to climate change, sustainability, and competitiveness. I mean, they're all part of one network, and we just, I think, have struggled at times to be able to find a way to encapsulate it in a way that is that captures, that galvanizes the public to say that, I care about that, and I want to know more about that, and this is what's going to really matter. So I think it's something that NOAA's really focused on, and we're really working on trying to improve and enhance our capacity and our efforts to engage on those issues. But I would agree with you that it is something that needs that enhanced attention, and we're trying to do that.
One thing I'll just quickly add for the last question is, I think one term that I haven't used yet today is the idea of a blue economy, which is a bit buzzwordy, I know, but it gets thrown around a lot. Secretary of Commerce, Dita Raimondo, is of course from my state of Rhode Island, and she talks about, in her previous life as governor of that state, talked about the Rhode Island blue economy all the time. We now President Biden has talked about the national blue economy and how we need to be moving towards a sustainable economy based around sustainable activities in the ocean. And globally, we're talking about this now. We have the high-level ocean panel talking about a sustainable blue economy. I think actually we've got now an RFI, a request for information from the administration, asking for input on a new plan for a sustainable blue economy. So that's going to be coming out later this fall, I would expect. Flex, you're probably plugged into that process. And so all these things talk about this idea of a sustainable blue economy, and central in that should always be fishing and fishers. And we talk here about illegality in fishing a lot, but we should recognize that when done well, fishing is a wonderful, sustainable activity, critical to the well-being of people on the planet. So I think we always need to be sort of centering that in our conversations as we move forward here. Okay, last question from online. In terms of empowering seafood workers' rights, not just fishers, but processors, how do we effectively educate and inform them of practices to advocate for themselves when many individuals are isolated and face coercion by employers against collective action? And Laura, I think that's screaming for you to jump in first.
It's not an easy question to answer, but I'll say that we work very hard to try and answer that question. Mm-hmm. How do you, but I think, again, I just getting back to, it means cultivating and empowering workers to have representative organizations, making sure that those are present and accessible when there aren't, when the legal, it's not able to do that, working with trade partners on international labor rights, freedom of association, collective bargaining, making that part of our trade agreements, part of the work that we're doing to forward and open up those spaces. I think that, that working with those groups and with those organizations are the best way to do that, and to do that in a way that you're ensuring that it's not just sort of raising expectation, but that there's an infrastructure to help support workers into accessing those rights. So that's the hard, it's hard to action, but that's the response to that.
Good. Well, I think that's a great question, and one that maybe doesn't have a great answer off the top, but I think is something that we should all sort of leave thinking about. So I want to give a really big round of applause for our panel. Really wonderful conversation. Thank you guys very much. And your willingness to go on a little bit longer. Before we go, we're going to close out our event here today with some final sort of capstone remarks from Kate O'Rourke, who's been the chief of party for SALT and who has been leading the effort for the past 5 years. So thank you, panel. Free to go. Really appreciate your time.
Great, thank you. So today's gathering is a testament to the far-reaching impact of SALT, a global community of governments, industry, and civil society committed to promoting legality and traceability in seafood. SALT's success is rooted in the power of collaboration. We have heard from everyone speaking today about the complex and systemic challenges we face regarding our oceans and seafood. And these challenges we cannot overcome in isolation. SALT approach unifies expertise, resources, and ideas from diverse stakeholders, amplifying our impact. We've witnessed governments, industry, NGOs, and communities transcending geographical and cultural boundaries to pursue sustainable, traceable, and ethical seafood supply chains. Our journey has been marked by significant milestones you heard about today, from co-designing best practices for comprehensive ECDT to building the capacity of seafood-producing country governments. SALT has consistently been at the forefront of positive change. The traceability community and resources that we've championed, and that's a collective we, are about building ECDT programs that can benefit our ocean economy, the environment, and seafood laborers. Seafood traceability and transparency are not merely buzzwords, but an urgent necessity. Nearly half of the world's population depends on seafood as a primary source of protein. The demand for seafood continues to rise, but the oceans are under immense pressure. Unsustainable fishing practices, IUU fishing, and climate change threaten the environment and food security. Seafood traceability and transparency play a crucial role in addressing these comprehensive challenges. By accurately tracking and verifying seafood data through a comprehensive ECDT program from catch to consumption, we can hold actors accountable, reduce the risk of IUU, and contribute to the safeguarding of marine ecosystems. The economic implications of our work are equally significant. The seafood industry is a global economic powerhouse. An estimated 600 million people depend at least partially on the seafood industry for their livelihoods, and it contributes substantially to economies worldwide. However, it is also vulnerable, as we've heard, to overfishing and unsustainable practices. So SALT's efforts to enhance traceability and promote legality have the potential to make the seafood industry more resilient. By fostering ethical and sustainable practices, we not only protect jobs, but also ensure the long-term viability of the industry. As we heard clearly in this last panel today, social responsibility is an integral part of a sustainable future. The seafood industry has faced long-standing challenges related to labor rights and working conditions. Our commitment extends beyond ecological and economic factors. It encompasses the well-being of communities that rely on the seas for their sustenance and livelihoods. We recognize the vital role of social responsibility in the seafood industry, and we must continue to advocate for fair labor practices, respect for Indigenous rights, and the empowerment of marginalized communities. Advancing gender equity in fisheries is a fundamental part of social responsibility as we plan for the future. Women comprise more than 50% of the seafood workforce, but their value and contributions are often unseen. Through ECDT programs, we can help bring women into the fold and address these systemic barriers by providing access to gender disaggregated data and increasing the visibility of women. With so much promise for the benefits of this work, let us leave here today with a renewed sense of purpose and determination. The journey to a more sustainable and responsible seafood industry continues. As we heard earlier, FishWise is thrilled to be carrying on some of the work of SALT as it transitions from a formal GDA with USAID and the Walton, Packard, and Moore family foundations. FishWise has 20 years of experience engaging seafood businesses, and we constantly strive to unite and align industry and government on these topics. We will continue to convene the SALT network, and we invite you all to remain engaged with this continuously growing community. And we also have several initiatives you heard about today, such as continuing the implementation of the ECDT strategy. We're seeking ways to continue to implement the ECDT strategy developed in Tanzania. With Blue Ports Initiative, we're building plans for both capacity building and implementation work for traceability in ports. And we'll continue to address inquiries received from stakeholders to continue designing traceability strategies and supporting governments, businesses, and NGOs. In closing, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to USAID, Packard, Moore, and Walton Family Foundations, the SALT Principal Advisory and Coordination Committee members, and the SALT community members who have contributed to the success of the Seafood Alliance for Legality and Traceability. Thank you to our panelists for your thoughtful discussion, to CSIS for hosting, and to all of you, thank you for your dedication, passion, and unwavering belief that has made all the difference. Thank you.